Question 12. How God is known by us. Prologue. As hitherto we have considered God as he is in himself, we now go on to consider in what manner he is in the knowledge of creatures, concerning which there are 13 points of inquiry. 1. Whether any created intellect can see the essence of God. 2. Whether the essence of God is seen by the intellect through any created image. 3. Whether the essence of God can be seen by the corporal eye. 4. Whether any created intellectual substance is sufficient by its own natural powers to see the essence of God. 5. Whether the created intellect needs any created light in order to see the essence of God. 6. Whether of those who see God, one sees him more perfectly than another. 7. Whether any created intellect can comprehend the essence of God. 8. Whether the created intellect, seeing the essence of God, knows all things in it. 9. Whether what is there known is known by any similitudes. 10. Whether the created intellect knows at once what it sees in God. 11. Whether in the state of this life any man can see the essence of God. 12. Whether by natural reason we can know God in this life. 13. Whether there is in this life any knowledge of God through grace above the knowledge of natural reason. Article 1. Whether any created intellect can see the essence of God. Objection 1. It seems that no created intellect can see the essence of God, for Chrysostom, 14 in John, commenting on John 1:18, no man hath seen God at any time, says, not prophets only, but neither angels nor archangels have seen God. For how can a creature see what is increatable? Dionysius also says, Div. Nom. 1, speaking of God, neither is there sense, nor image, nor opinion, nor reason, nor knowledge of him. Objection 2. Further, everything infinite, as such, is unknown, but God is infinite, as was shown above, question 7, article 1, therefore in himself he is unknown. Objection 3. Further, the created intellect knows only existing things, for what falls first under the apprehension of the intellect is being. Now God is not something existing, but he is rather superexistence, as Dionysius says, Div. Nom. 4. Therefore God is not intelligible, but above all intellect. Objection 4. Further, there must be some proportion between the knower and the known, since the known is the perfection of the knower, but no proportion exists between the created intellect and God, for there is an infinite distance between them. Therefore, the created intellect cannot see the essence of God. On the contrary, it is written, we shall see him as he is. 1 John 2:2. I answer that, since everything is knowable according as it is actual, God, who is pure act without any admixture of potentiality, is in himself supremely knowable. But what is supremely knowable in itself may not be knowable to a particular intellect, on account of the excess of the intelligible object above the intellect. As, for example, the sun, which is supremely visible, cannot be seen by the bat by reason of its excess of light. Therefore, some who considered this held that no created intellect can see the essence of God. This opinion, however, is not tenable, for as the ultimate beatitude of man consists in the use of his highest function, which is the operation of his intellect, if we suppose that the created intellect could never see God, it would either never attain to beatitude, or its beatitude would consist in something else beside God, which is opposed to faith. For the ultimate perfection of the rational creature is to be found in that which is the principle of its being, since a thing is perfect so far as it attains to its principle. Further, the same opinion is also against reason, for there resides in every man a natural desire to know the cause of any effect which he sees, and thence arises wonder in men. But if the intellect of the rational creature could not reach so far as to the first cause of things, the natural desire would remain void. Hence, it must be absolutely granted that the blessed see the essence of God. Reply to objection 1. Both of these authorities speak of the vision of comprehension. Hence, Dionysius premises immediately before the word cited, he is universally to all incomprehensible, etc. Chrysostom, likewise, after the words quoted says, he says this of the most certain vision of the Father. which is such a perfect consideration and comprehension as the Father has of the Son. Reply to objection 2. The infinity of matter not made perfect by form is unknown in itself, because all knowledge comes by the form, whereas the infinity of the form not limited by matter is in itself supremely known. God is infinite in this way, and not in the first way, as appears from what was said above, question 7, article 1. Reply to objection 3. God is not said to be not existing as if he did not exist at all, but because he exists above all that exists, inasmuch as he is his own existence. Hence it does not follow that he cannot be known at all, but that he exceeds every kind of knowledge, which means that he is not comprehended. Reply to objection 4. Proportion is twofold. In one sense, it means a certain relation of one quantity to another. According as double, treble, and equal are species of proportion. In another sense, every relation of one thing to another is called proportion, and in this sense there can be a proportion of the creature to God, inasmuch as it is related to him as the effect of its cause, and as potentiality to its act, and in this way the created intellect can be proportioned to know God. Article 2. Whether the essence of God is seen by the created intellect through an image. Objection 1. It seems that the essence of God is seen through an image by the created intellect. For it is written, "We know that when he shall appear, we shall be like to him, and we shall see him as he is." 1 John 3:2. Objection 2. Further, Augustine says that Trine 5, when we know God, some likeness of God is made in us. Objection 3. Further, the intellect in act is the actual intelligible, as sense in act is the actual sensible. But this comes about inasmuch as sense is informed with the likeness of the sensible object, and the intellect with the likeness of the thing understood. Therefore, if God is seen by the created intellect in act, it must be that he is seen by some similitude. On the contrary, Augustine says, De Trine 15, that when the apostle says, "We see through a glass and in an enigma," by the terms glass and enigma, certain similitudes are signified by him, which are accommodated to the vision of God. But to see the essence of God is not an enigmatic nor a speculative vision, but is, on the contrary, of an opposite kind. Therefore the divine essence is not seen through a similitude. I answer that two things are required both for sensible and for intellectual vision, viz., power of sight, and union of the thing seen with the sight. For vision is made actual only when the thing seen is in a certain way in the seer. Now in corporal things it is clear that the thing seen cannot be by its essence in the seer, but only by its likeness, as the similitude of a stone is in the eye, whereby the vision is made actual, whereas the substance of the stone is not there. But if the principle of the visual power and the thing seen were one and the same thing, it would necessarily follow that the seer would receive both the visual power and the form whereby it sees from that one same thing. Now, it is manifest both that God is the author of the intellect's power, and that he can be seen by the intellect. And since the intellective power of the creature is not the essence of God, it follows that it is some kind of participated likeness of him, who is the first intellect. Hence, also the intellectual power of the creature is called an intelligible light, as it were, derived from the first light, whether this be understood of the natural power, or of some perfection, superadded of grace or of glory. Therefore, in order to see God, there must be some similitude of God on the part of the visual faculty, whereby the intellect is made capable of seeing God, but on the part of the object seen, which must necessarily be united to the seer. The essence of God cannot be seen by any created similitude. First, because as Dionysius says, Div Nom, Book 1, by the similitudes of the inferior order of things, the superior can in no way be known, as by the likeness of a body the essence of an incorporeal thing cannot be known. Much less, therefore, can the essence of God be seen by any created likeness whatever. Secondly, because the essence of God is his own very existence, as was shown above, question 3, article 4, which cannot be said of any created form, and so no created form can be the similitude representing the essence of God to the seer. Thirdly, because the divine essence is uncircumscribed and contains in itself supereminently whatever can be signified or understood by the created intellect. Now, this cannot in any way be represented by any created likeness, for every created form is determined according to some aspect of wisdom, or of power, or of being itself, or of some like thing. Hence, to say that God is seen by some similitude is to say that the divine essence is not seen at all, which is false. Therefore, it must be said that to see the essence of God, there is required some similitude in the visual faculty, namely, the light of glory strengthening the intellect to see God, which is spoken of in the Psalm 35:10, "In thy light we shall see light." The essence of God, however, cannot be seen by any created similitude, representing the divine essence itself as it really is. Reply to objection 1. The authority speaks of the similitude which is caused by participation of the light of glory. Reply to objection 2. Augustine speaks of the knowledge of God here on earth. Reply to objection 3. The divine essence is existence itself. Hence, as other intelligible forms which are not their own existence are united to the intellect by means of some entity, whereby the intellect itself is informed and made an act, so the divine essence is united to the created intellect, as the object actually understood, making the intellect an act by and of itself. Article 3. Whether the essence of God can be seen with the bodily eye. Objection 1. It seems that the essence of God can be seen by the corporal eye. For it is written, Job 19:26, "In my flesh I shall see God," and Job 42:5, "With the hearing of the ear I have heard thee, but now my eye seeth thee." Objection 2. Further, Augustine says, De Civ. de XXIX 29, those eyes, namely the glorified, will therefore have a greater power of sight, not so much to see more keenly, as some report of the sight of serpents or of eagles. For whatever acuteness of vision is possessed by these creatures, they can see only corporal things, but to see even incorporeal things. Now whoever can see incorporeal things can be raised up to see God. Therefore the glorified eye can see God. Objection 3. Further, God can be seen by man through a vision of the imagination. For it is written, I saw the Lord sitting upon a throne, etc. Isaiah 6:1. But an imaginary vision originates from sense, for the imagination is moved by sense to act. Therefore God can be seen by a vision of sense. On the contrary, Augustine says, De vid deum ep cxlvii. No one has ever seen God either in this life as he is, nor in the angelic life, as visible things are seen by corporal vision. I answer that it is impossible for God to be seen by the sense of sight, or by any other sense, or faculty of the sensitive power, for every such kind of power is the act of a corporal organ, as will be shown later, question 78. Now act is proportional to the nature which possesses it. Hence, no power of that kind can go beyond corporal things, for God is incorporeal, as was shown above, question 3, article 1. Hence, he cannot be seen by the sense or the imagination, but only by the intellect. Reply to objection 1. The words, "In my flesh I shall see God my Savior," do not mean that God will be seen with the eye of the flesh, but that man existing in the flesh after the resurrection will see God. Likewise, the words, "Now my eye seeth thee," are to be understood of the mind's eye, as the Apostle says, "May he give unto you the spirit of wisdom, in the knowledge of him, that the eyes of your heart may be enlightened." Ephesians 1:17-18. Reply to objection 2. Augustine speaks as one inquiring, and conditionally. This appears from what he says previously. Therefore, they will have an altogether different power, viz. the glorified eyes, if they shall see that incorporeal nature, and afterwards he explains this, saying it is very credible that we shall so see the mundane bodies of the new heaven and the new earth, as to see most clearly God everywhere present, governing all corporal things, not as we now see the invisible things of God, as we understood by what is made, but as when we see men among whom we live, living and exercising the functions of human life, we do not believe they live, but see it. Hence it is evident how the glorified eyes will see God, as now our eyes see the life of another. But life is not seen with the corporal eye, as a thing in itself visible, but as the indirect object of the sense, which indeed is not known by sense, but at once, together with sense, by some other cognitive power, but that the divine presence is known by the intellect immediately on the sight of, and through corporal things, happens from two causes, viz. From the perspicuity of the intellect, and from the refulgence of the divine glory infused into the body after its renovation. Reply to objection 3. The essence of God is not seen in a vision of the imagination, but the imagination receives some form representing God according to some mode of similitude, as in the divine scripture, divine things are metaphorically described by means of sensible things. Article 4. Whether any created intellect by its natural powers can see the divine essence. Objection 1. It seems that a created intellect can see the divine essence by its own natural power. For Dionysius says, Div Nom 4, an angel is a pure mirror, most clear, receiving, if it is right to say so, the whole beauty of God. But if a reflection is seen, the original thing is seen. Therefore, since an angel by his natural power understands himself, it seems that by his own natural power he understands the divine essence. Objection 2. Further, what is supremely visible is made less visible to us by reason of our defective corporal or intellectual sight. But the angelic intellect has no such defect. Therefore, since God is supremely intelligible in himself, it seems that in like manner he is supremely so to an angel. Therefore, if he can understand other intelligible things by his own natural power, much more can he understand God. Objection 3. Further, corporal sense cannot be raised up to understand incorporeal substance, which is above its nature. Therefore, if to see the essence of God is above the nature of every created intellect, it follows that no created intellect can reach up to see the essence of God at all. But this is false, as appears from what is said, Article 1. Therefore, it seems that it is natural for a created intellect to see the divine essence. On the contrary, it is written, "The grace of God is life everlasting." Romans 6:23. But life everlasting consists in the vision of the divine essence, according to the words, "This is eternal life, that they may know thee, the only true God," etc. John 17:3. Therefore, to see the essence of God is possible to the created intellect by grace, and not by nature. I answer that it is impossible for any created intellect to see the essence of God by its own natural power, for knowledge is regulated according as the thing known is in the knower, but the thing known is in the knower according to the mode of the knower. Hence the knowledge of every knower is ruled according to its own nature. If therefore the mode of anything's being exceeds the mode of the knower, it must result that the knowledge of the object is above the nature of the knower. Now the mode of being of things is manifold, for some things have being only in this one individual matter, as all bodies, but others are subsisting natures, not residing in matter at all, which, however, are not their own existence, but receive it, and these are the incorporeal beings called angels. But to God alone does it belong to be his own subsistent being. Therefore, what exists only in individual matter we know naturally, for as much as our soul, whereby we know, is the form of certain matter. Now our soul possesses two cognitive powers. One is the act of a corporal organ, which naturally knows things existing in individual matter. Hence sense knows only the singular. But there is another kind of cognitive power in the soul, called the intellect, and this is not the act of any corporal organ. Wherefore the intellect naturally knows natures which exist only in individual matter, not as they are in such individual matter, but according as they are abstracted therefrom by the considering act of the intellect. Hence it follows that through the intellect we can understand these objects as universal, and this is beyond the power of the sense. Now the angelic intellect naturally knows natures that are not in matter, but this is beyond the power of the intellect of our soul in the state of its present life, united as it is to the body. It follows therefore that to know self-subsistent being is natural to the divine intellect alone, and this is beyond the natural power of any created intellect, for no creature is its own existence, for as much as its existence is participated. Therefore, the created intellect cannot see the essence of God, unless God by his grace unites himself to the created intellect, as an object made intelligible to it. Reply to objection 1. This mode of knowing God is natural to an angel, namely, to know him by his own likeness, refulgent in the angel himself. But to know God by any created similitude is not to know the essence of God, as was shown above, Article 2. Hence, it does not follow that an angel can know the essence of God by his own power. Reply to objection 2. The angelic intellect is not defective. if defect be taken to mean privation, as if it were without anything which it ought to have. But if the defect be taken negatively, in that sense every creature is defective, when compared with God, forasmuch as it does not possess the excellence which is in God. Reply to objection 3. The sense of sight, as being altogether immaterial, cannot be raised up to immateriality. But our intellect, or the angelic intellect, inasmuch as it is elevated above matter in its own nature, can be raised above its own nature to a higher level by grace. The proof is that sight cannot in any way know abstractedly what it knows concretely. For in no way can it perceive a nature except as this one particular nature, whereas our intellect is able to consider abstractedly what it knows concretely. Now, although it knows things which have a form residing in matter, still it resolves the composite into both of these elements, and it considers the form separately by itself. Likewise, also, the intellect of an angel, although it naturally knows the concrete in any nature, still it is able to separate that existence by its intellect, since it knows that the thing itself is one thing and its existence is another. Since therefore the created intellect is naturally capable of apprehending the concrete form and the concrete being abstractedly, by way of a kind of resolution of parts, it can by grace be raised up to know separate subsisting substance and separate subsisting existence. Article 5. Whether the created intellect needs any created light in order to see the essence of God. Objection 1. It seems that the created intellect does not need any created light in order to see the essence of God. For what is of itself lucid in sensible things does not require any other light in order to be seen. Therefore the same applies to intelligible things. Now God is intelligible light, therefore he is not seen by means of any created light. Objection 2. Further, if God is seen through a medium, he is not seen in his essence, but if seen by any created light, he is seen through a medium, therefore he is not seen in his essence. Objection 3. Further, what is created can be natural to some creature. Therefore, if the essence of God is seen through any created light, such a light can be made natural to some other creature, and thus that creature would not need any other light to see God, which is impossible. Therefore, it is not necessary that every creature should require a superadded light in order to see the essence of God. On the contrary, it is written, "In thy light we shall see light." Psalms 35:10. I answer that everything which is raised up to what exceeds its nature must be prepared by some disposition above its nature. As, for example, if air is to receive the form of fire, it must be prepared by some disposition for such a form. But when any created intellect sees the essence of God, the essence of God itself becomes the intelligible form of the intellect. Hence, it is necessary that some supernatural disposition should be added to the intellect in order that it may be raised up to such a great and sublime height. Now, since the natural power of the created intellect does not avail to enable it to see the essence of God, as was shown in the preceding article, it is necessary that the power of understanding should be added by divine grace. Now, this increase of the intellectual powers is called the illumination of the intellect, as we also call the intelligible object itself by the name of the light of illumination. And this is the light spoken of in the Apocalypse, Apoc 21:23. The glory of God hath enlightened it, viz., the society of the blessed who see God. By this light the blessed are made deiform, that is, like to God. According to the saying, when he shall appear, we shall be like to him, and we shall see him as he is. 1 John 2:2. Reply to objection 1. The created light is necessary to see the essence of God, not in order to make the essence of God intelligible, which is of itself intelligible, but in order to enable the intellect to understand in the same way as a habit makes a power abler to act. Even so, corporal light is necessary as regards external sight, inasmuch as it makes the medium actually transparent and susceptible of color. Reply to objection 2. This light is required to see the divine essence, not as a similitude in which God is seen, but as a perfection of the intellect, strengthening it to see God. Therefore, it may be said that this light is to be described not as a medium in which God is seen, but as one by which he is seen, and such a medium does not take away the immediate vision of God. Reply to objection 3. The disposition to the form of fire can be natural only to the subject of that form. Hence, the light of glory cannot be natural to a creature, unless the creature has a divine nature, which is impossible. But by this light, the rational creature is made deiform, as is said in this article. Article 6. Whether of those who see the essence of God, one sees more perfectly than another. Objection 1. It seems that of those who see the essence of God, one does not see more perfectly than another. For it is written, 1 John 3:2, we shall see him as he is. But he is only in one way, therefore he will be seen by all in one way only, and therefore he will not be seen more perfectly by one and less perfectly by another. Objection 2. Further, Augustine says, octog tre quo est q xxxii. One person cannot see one and the same thing more perfectly than another, but all who see the essence of God understand the divine essence, for God is seen by the intellect and not by sense, as was shown above, Article 3. Therefore, of those who see the divine essence, one does not see more clearly than another. Objection 3. Further, that anything be more seen perfectly than another can happen in two ways, either on part of the visible object or on part of the visual power of the seer. On the part of the object, it may so happen because the object is received more perfectly in the seer, that is, according to the greater perfection of the similitude. But this does not apply to the present question, for God is present to the intellect, seeing him not by way of similitude, but by his essence. It follows, then, that if one sees him more perfectly than another, this happens according to the difference of the intellectual power. Thus, it follows, too, that the one whose intellectual power is higher will see him the more clearly, and this is incongruous, since equality with angels is promised to men as their beatitude. On the contrary, eternal life consists in the vision of God, according to John 17:3. This is eternal life, that they may know thee, the only true God, etc. Therefore, if all saw the essence of God equally in eternal life, all would be equal. The contrary to which is declared by the apostle, stars differs from star in glory, 1 Corinthians 15:41. I answer that, of those who see the essence of God, one sees him more perfectly than another. This, indeed, does not take place as if one had a more perfect similitude of God than another, since that vision will not spring from any similitude, but it will take place because one intellect will have a greater power or faculty to see God than another. The faculty of seeing God, however, does not belong to the created intellect naturally, but is given to it by the light of glory, which establishes the intellect in a kind of deiformity, as appears from what is said above in the preceding article. Hence the intellect which has more of the light of glory will see God the more perfectly, and he will have a fuller participation of the light of glory who has more charity, because where there is the greater charity, there is the more desire, and desire in a certain degree makes the one desiring apt and prepared to receive the object desired. Hence he who possesses the more charity will see God the more perfectly, and will be the more beatified. Reply to objection 1. In the words, we shall see him as he is, the conjunction as determines the mode of vision on the part of the object seen, so that the meaning is, we shall see him to be as he is, because we shall see his existence, which is his essence, but it does not determine the mode of vision on the part of the one seeing, as if the meaning was that the mode of seeing God will be as perfect as is the perfect mode of God's existence. Thus appears the answer to the second objection. For when it is said that one intellect does not understand one and the same better than another, this would be true if referred to the mode of the thing understood. For whoever understands it otherwise than it really is, does not truly understand it, but not if referred to the mode of understanding, for the understanding of one is more perfect than the understanding of another. Reply to objection 3. The diversity of seeing will not arise on the part of the object seen, for the same object will be presented to all, viz. The essence of God, nor will it arise from the diverse participation of the object seen by different similitudes, but it will arise on the part of the diverse faculty of the intellect, not, indeed, the natural faculty, but the glorified faculty. Article 7. Whether those who see the essence of God comprehend him. Objection 1. It seems that those who see the divine essence comprehend God, for the apostle says, Phil 3:12, but I follow after, if I may by any means comprehend. But the apostle did not follow in vain, for he said 1 Corinthians 9:26, I ... so run, not as at an uncertainty. Therefore he comprehended, and in the same way others also, whom he invites to do the same, saying, so run that you may comprehend. Objection 2. Further, Augustine says, David dium ep cxlvii, that is comprehended which is so seen as a whole, that nothing of it is hidden from the seer. But if God is seen in his essence, he is seen whole, and nothing of him is hidden from the seer. Since God is simple, therefore whoever sees his essence comprehends him. Objection 3. Further, if we say that he is seen as a whole, but not wholly, it may be contrarily urged that wholly refers either to the mode of the seer, or to the mode of the thing seen. But he who sees the essence of God sees him wholly, if the mode of the thing seen is considered. For as much as he sees him as he is, also likewise he sees him wholly, if the mode of the seer is meant. For as much as the intellect will, with its full power, see the divine essence, therefore all who see the essence of God see him wholly, therefore they comprehend him. On the contrary, it is written, O most mighty, great, and powerful, the Lord of hosts is thy name, great in counsel and incomprehensible in thought. Jeremiah 32:18-19. Therefore, he cannot be comprehended. I answer that it is impossible for any created intellect to comprehend God. Yet, for the mind to attain to God in some degree is great beatitude, as Augustine says, de verb dim serm xxxvii. In proof of this, we must consider that what is comprehended is perfectly known, and that is perfectly known which is known so far as it can be known. Thus, if anything which is capable of scientific demonstration is held only by an opinion resting on a probability proof, it is not comprehended. As, for instance, if anyone knows by scientific demonstration that a triangle has 3 angles equal to 2 right angles, he comprehends that truth. Whereas if anyone accepts that it is as a probable opinion because wise men or most men teach it, he cannot be said to comprehend the thing itself, because he does not attain to that perfect mode of knowledge of which it is intrinsically capable. But no created intellect can attain to that perfect mode of knowledge of the divine intellect, whereof it is intrinsically capable, which thus appears, everything is knowable according to its actuality, but God, whose being is infinite, as was shown above, question 7, is infinitely knowable. Now no created intellect can know God infinitely, for the created intellect knows the divine essence more or less perfectly in proportion as it receives a greater or lesser light of glory. Since therefore the created light of glory received into any created intellect cannot be infinite, it is clearly impossible for any created intellect to know God in an infinite degree. Hence it is impossible that it should comprehend God. Reply to objection 1. Comprehension is twofold. In one sense, it is taken strictly and properly according as something is included in the one comprehending, and thus in no way is God comprehended either by intellect or in any other way. For as much as he is infinite and cannot be included in any finite being, so that no finite being can contain him infinitely, in the degree of his own infinity. In this sense, we now take comprehension, but in another sense, comprehension is taken more largely as opposed to non-attainment. For he who attains to anyone is said to comprehend him when he attains to him. And in this sense, God is comprehended by the blessed, according to the words, I held him, and I will not let him go. Cant 3:4. In this sense also are to be understood the words quoted from the apostle concerning comprehension, and in this way comprehension is one of the 3 prerogatives of the soul, responding to hope, as vision responds to faith, and fruition responds to charity. For even among ourselves, not everything seen is held or possessed. For as much as things either appear sometimes afar off, or they are not in our power of attainment, neither again do we always enjoy what we possess, either because we find no pleasure in them, or because such things are not the ultimate end of our desire, so as to satisfy and quell it. But the blessed possess these three things in God, because they see him, and in seeing him possess him as present, having the power to see him always, and possessing him. They enjoy him as the ultimate fulfillment of desire. Reply to objection 2. God is called incomprehensible, not because anything of him is not seen, but because he is not seen as perfectly as he is capable of being seen. Thus, when any demonstrable proposition is known by probable reason only, it does not follow that any part of it is unknown, either the subject or the predicate or the composition, but that it is not as perfectly known as it is capable of being known. Hence, Augustine, in his definition of comprehension, says the whole is comprehended when it is seen in such a way that nothing of it is hidden from the seer, or when its boundaries can be completely viewed or traced. For the boundaries of a thing are said to be completely surveyed when the end of the knowledge of it is attained. Reply to objection 3. The word wholly denotes a mode of the object, but not. The word wholly denotes a mode of the object, not that the whole object does not come under knowledge, but that the mode of the object is not the mode of the one who knows. Therefore, he who sees God's essence sees in him that he exists infinitely, and is infinitely knowable. Nevertheless, this infinite mode does not extend to enable the knower to know infinitely. Thus, for instance, a person can have a probable opinion that a proposition is demonstrable, although he himself does not know it is as demonstrated. Article 8. Whether those who see the essence of God see all in God. Objection 1. It seems that those who see the essence of God see all things in God. For Gregory says, Dialogue 4, what do they not see? Who see him who sees all things. But God sees all things. Therefore those who see God see all things. Objection 2. Further, whoever sees a mirror sees what is reflected in the mirror. But all actual or possible things shine forth in God as in a mirror, for he knows all things in himself. Therefore, whoever sees God sees all actual things in him, and also all possible things. Objection 3. Further, whoever understands the greater can understand the least, as is said in De Anima 3. But all that God does or can do are less than his essence. Therefore, whoever understands God can understand all that God does or can do. Objection 4. Further, the rational creature naturally desires to know all things. Therefore, if in seeing God it does not know all things, its natural desire will not rest satisfied. Thus, in seeing God it will not be fully happy, which is incongruous. Therefore, he who sees God knows all things. On the contrary, the angels see the essence of God, and yet do not know all things. For as Dionysius says, Coed Hied 7, the inferior angels are cleansed from ignorance by the superior angels. Also, they are ignorant of future contingent things, and of secret thoughts, for this knowledge belongs to God alone. Therefore, whosoever sees the essence of God does not know all things. I answer that the created intellect, in seeing the divine essence, does not see in it all that God does or can do. For it is manifest that things are seen in God as they are in him, but all other things are in God as effects are in the power of their cause. Therefore all things are seen in God as an effect is seen in its cause. Now it is clear that the more perfectly a cause is seen, the more of its effects can be seen in it. For whoever has a lofty understanding, as soon as one demonstrative principle is put before him, can gather the knowledge of many conclusions. But this is beyond one of a weaker intellect, for he needs things to be explained to him separately, and so an intellect can know all the effects of a cause, and the reasons for those effects in the cause itself, if it comprehends the cause wholly. Now, no created intellect can comprehend God wholly, as shown above, Article 7. Therefore, no created intellect in seeing God can know all that God does or can do, for this would be to comprehend his power. But of what God does or can do, any intellect can know the more perfectly it sees God. Reply to objection 1. Gregory speaks As regards the object being sufficient, namely God, who in himself sufficiently contains and shows forth all things. But it does not follow that whoever sees God knows all things, for he does not perfectly comprehend him. Reply to objection 2. It is not necessary that whoever sees a mirror should see all that is in the mirror, unless his glance comprehends the mirror itself. Reply to objection 3. Although it is more to see God than to see all things else, still it is a greater thing to see him so that all things are known in him, than to see him in such a way that not all things, but the fewer or more, are known in him. For it has been shown in this article that the more things are known in God, according as he is seen more or less perfectly. Reply to objection 4. The natural desire of the rational creature is to know everything that belongs to the perfection of the intellect, namely, the species and the genera of things and their types, and these everyone who sees the divine essence will see in God. But to know other singulars, their thoughts and their deeds, does not belong to the perfection of the created intellect, nor does its natural desire go out to these things. Neither, again, does it desire to know things that exist, not as yet, but which God can call into being. Yet if God alone were seen, who is the fount and principle of all being and of all truth, he would so fill the natural desire of knowledge that nothing else would be desired, and the seer would be completely beatified. Hence Augustine says, Confessions 5, Unhappy the man who knoweth all these, that is, all creatures, and knoweth not thee. But happy whoso knoweth thee, although he know not these. And whoso knoweth both thee and them is not the happier for them, but for thee alone. Article 9. Whether what is seen in God by those who see the divine essence is seen through any similitude. Objection 1. It seems that what is seen in God by those who see the divine essence is seen by means of some similitude, for every kind of knowledge comes about by the knower being assimilated to that object known, for thus the intellect in act becomes the actual intelligible, and the sense in act becomes the actual sensible, inasmuch as it is informed by a similitude of the object, as the eye by the similitude of color. Therefore, if the intellect of one who sees the divine essence understands any creatures in God, it must be informed by their similitudes. Objection 2. Further, what we have seen we keep in memory. But Paul, seeing the essence of God, whiles in ecstasy, when he had ceased to see the divine essence, as Augustine says, Gen. Ad Lit. 2, 28:34, remembered many of the things he had seen in the rapture. Hence he said, I have heard secret words which it is not granted to man to utter. 2 Corinthians 12:4. Therefore it must be said that certain similitudes of what he remembered remained in his mind, and in the same way, when he actually saw the essence of God, he had certain similitudes or ideas of what he actually saw in it. On the contrary, a mirror and what is in it are seen by means of one likeness, but all things are seen in God as in an intelligible mirror. Therefore, if God himself is not seen by any similitude, but by his own essence, neither are the things seen in him seen by any similitudes or ideas. I answer that those who see the divine essence see what they see in God not by any likeness, but by the divine essence itself united to their intellect. For each thing is known insofar as its likeness is in the one who knows. Now, this takes place in two ways. For as things which are like one and the same thing are like to each other, the cognitive faculty can be assimilated to any knowable object in two ways. In one way, it is assimilated by the object itself, when it is directly informed by a similitude, and then the object is known in itself. In another way, when informed by a similitude which resembles the object, and in this way, the knowledge is not of the thing in itself, but of the thing in its likeness. For the knowledge of a man in himself differs from the knowledge of him in his image. Hence, to know things thus by their likeness in the one who knows is to know them in themselves or in their own nature. Whereas to know them by their similitudes pre-existing in God is to see them in God. Hence, there is a difference between these two kinds of knowledge. Hence, according to the knowledge whereby things are known by those who see the essence of God, they are seen in God himself, not by any other similitudes, but by the divine essence alone present to the intellect, which also God himself is seen. Reply to objection 1. The created intellect of one who sees God is assimilated to what is seen in God, inasmuch as it is united to the divine essence, in which the similitudes of all things pre-exist. Reply to objection 2. Some of the cognitive faculties form other images from those first conceived. Thus, the imagination from the preconceived images of a mountain and of gold can form the likeness of a golden mountain, and the intellect, from the preconceived ideas of genus and difference, forms the idea of species. In like manner, from the similitude of an image we can form in our minds the similitude of the original of the image. Thus, Paul or any other person who sees God, by the very vision of the divine essence, can form in himself the similitudes of what is seen in the divine essence, which remained in Paul even when he had ceased to see the essence of God. Still, this kind of vision whereby things are seen by this likeness, thus conceived, is not the same as that whereby things are seen in God. Article 10. Whether those who see the essence of God see all they see in it at the same time. Objection 1. It seems that those who see the essence of God do not see all they see in him at one and the same time. For according to the philosopher, topic 2, it may happen that many things are known, but only one is understood. But what is seen in God is understood, for God is seen by the intellect. Therefore those who see God do not see all in him at the same time. Objection 2. Further, Augustine says, Gen. Ad lit. 8:22-23, God moves the spiritual creature according to time, that is, by intelligence and affection. But the spiritual creature is the angel who sees God. Therefore, those who see God understand and are affected successively, for time means succession. On the contrary, Augustine says, De Trine, 16, our thoughts will not be unstable, going to and fro from one thing to another, but we shall see all we know at one glance. I answer that what is seen in the word is seen not successively, but at the same time. In proof whereof, we ourselves cannot know many things all at once, for as much as understand many things by means of many ideas, but our intellect cannot be actually informed by many diverse ideas at the same time, so as to understand by them, as one body cannot bear different shapes simultaneously. Hence, when many things can be understood by one idea, they are understood at the same time, as the parts of a whole are understood successively, and not all at the same time, if each one is understood by its own idea, whereas if all are understood under the one idea of the whole, they are understood simultaneously. Now it was shown above that things seen in God are not seen singly by their own similitude, but all are seen by the one essence of God, hence they are seen simultaneously and not successively. Reply to Objection 1. We understand one thing only when we understand by one idea, but many things understood by one idea are understood simultaneously, as in the idea of a man we understand animal and rational, and in the idea of a house we understand the wall and the roof. Reply to Objection 2. As regards their natural knowledge, whereby they know things by diverse ideas given them, the angels do not know all things simultaneously, and thus they are moved in the act of understanding according to time, but as regards what they see in God, they see all at the same time. Article 11. Whether anyone in this life can see the essence of God. Objection 1. It seems that one can in this life see the divine essence. For Jacob said, I have seen God face to face. GN 32:30. Or I think that's Genesis 32:30. But to see him face to face is to see his essence, as appears from the words, we see now in a glass and in a dark manner, but then face to face. 1 Corinthians 13:12. Objection 2. Further, the Lord said to Moses, I speak to him mouth to mouth and plainly, and not by riddles and figures doth he see the Lord. Numbers 12:8. But this is to see God in his essence. Therefore, it is possible to see the essence of God in this life. Objection 3. Further, that wherein we know all other things, and whereby we judge of other things, is known in itself to us. But even now we know all things in God. For Augustine says, Confessions 8, if we both see that what you say is true, and we both see that what I say is true, or I ask, do we see this? Neither I in thee, nor thou in me, but both of us in the very incommutable truth itself above our minds. He also says, De vera velig xxx, that we judge of all things according to the divine truth, and De trine xii, 12, that it is the duty of reason to judge of these corporal things according to the incorporeal and and eternal ideas, which, unless they were above the mind, could not be incommutable. Therefore, even in this life, we see God himself. Objection 4. Further, according to Augustine, Gen. Ad Lit. 12, 24, 25, those things that are in the soul by their essence are seen by intellectual vision. But intellectual vision is of intelligible things, not by similitudes, but by their very essences. As he also says, Gen. Ad Lit. 13, 24, 25. Therefore, since God is in our soul by his essence, it follows that he is seen by us in his essence. On the contrary, it is written, "Man shall not see me and live." Exodus 32:20. And a gloss upon this says, "In this mortal life, God can be seen by certain images, but not by the likeness itself of his own nature." I answer that God cannot be seen in its essence by a mere human being, except he be separated from this mortal life. The reason is because, as was said above, Article 4, the mode of knowledge follows the mode of the nature of the knower. But our soul, as long as we live in this life, has its being in corporal matter. Hence, naturally, it knows only what has a form in matter, or what can be known by such a form. Now, it is evident that the divine essence cannot be known through the nature of material things. For it was shown above, Articles 2:9, that the knowledge of God by means of any created similitude is not the vision of his essence. Hence, it is impossible for the soul of man in this life to see the essence of God. This can be seen in the fact that the more our soul is abstracted from corporal things, the more it is capable of receiving abstract intelligible things. Hence, in dreams and alienations of the bodily senses, divine revelations and foresight of future events are perceived the more clearly. It is not possible, therefore, that the soul in this mortal life should be raised up to the supreme of intelligible objects, that is, to the divine essence. Reply to Objection 1. According to Dionysius Coelhier 4, a man is said in the scripture to see God in the sense that certain figures are formed in the senses or imagination, according to some similitude, representing in part the divinity. So when Jacob says, "I have seen God face to face," this does not mean the divine essence, but some figure representing God, and this is to be referred to some high mode of prophecy, so that God seems to speak, though in an imaginary vision, as will later be explained. SS question 174. In treating of the degrees of prophecy, we may also say that Jacob spoke thus to designate some exalted intellectual contemplation above the ordinary state. Reply to Objection 2. As God works miracles in corporal things, so also he does supernatural wonders above the common order, raising the minds of some living in the flesh beyond the use of sense, even up to the vision of his own essence. As Augustine says, Gen. Ad Lit. 12, 26, 27, 28, of Moses, the teacher of the Jews, and of Paul, the teacher of the Gentiles. This will be treated more fully in the question of rapture, SS question 175. Reply to Objection 3. All things are said to be seen in God, and all things are judged in him, because by the participation of his light we know and judge all things, for the light of natural reason itself is a participation of the divine light, as likewise we are said to see and judge of sensible things in the sun, that is, by the sun's light. Hence Augustine says, Soliloque, book 1:8, the lessons of instruction can only be seen as it were by their own sun, namely God. As therefore, in order to see a sensible object, it is not necessary to see the substance of the sun. So in like manner, to see any intelligible object, it is not necessary to see the essence of God. Reply to Objection 4. Intellectual vision is of the things which are in the soul by their essence, as intelligible things are in the intellect, and thus God is in the souls of the blessed. Not thus is he in our soul, but by presence, essence, and power. Article 12. Whether God can be known in this life by natural reason. Objection 1. It seems that by natural reason we cannot know God in this life. For Boethius says, De Consol 5, that reason does not grasp simple form, but God is a supremely simple form, as was shown above, question 3, article 7. Therefore, natural reason cannot attain to know him. Objection 2. Further, the soul understands nothing by natural reason without the use of imagination. But we cannot have an imagination of God who is incorporeal. Therefore, we cannot know God by natural knowledge. Objection 3. Further, the knowledge of natural reason belongs to both good and evil, inasmuch as they have a common nature. But the knowledge of God belongs only to the good. For Augustine says, De Trine, 1, the weak eye of the human mind is not fixed on that excellent light, unless purified by the justice of faith. Therefore God cannot be known by natural reason. On the contrary, it is written, Romans 1:19, that which is known of God, namely, what can be known of God by natural reason, is manifest in them. I answer that our natural knowledge begins from sense. Hence, our natural knowledge can go as far as it can be led by sensible things, but our mind cannot be led by sense so far as to see the essence of God, because the sensible effects of God do not equal the power of God as their cause. Hence, from the knowledge of sensible things, the whole power of God cannot be known, nor therefore can his essence be seen. But because they are his effects and depend on their cause, we can be led from them so far as to know of God whether he exists, and to know of him what must necessarily belong to him, as the first cause of all things, exceeding all things caused by him. Hence, we know that his relationship with creatures so far as to be the cause of them all. Also that creatures differ from him, inasmuch as he is not in any way part of what is caused by him, and that creatures are not removed from him by reason of any defect on his part, but because he super exceeds them all. A reply to objection 1. Reason cannot reach up to simple form so as to know what it is, but it can know whether it is. Reply to objection 2. God is known by natural knowledge through the images of his effects. Reply to objection 3. As the knowledge of God's essence is by grace, it belongs only to the good. But the knowledge of him by natural reason can belong to both good and bad, and hence Augustine says, Retract, 1. Retracting what he had said before, I do not approve what I said in prayer. God who willest that only the pure should know the truth, or should know truth. For it can be answered that many who are not pure can know many truths, that is, by natural reason. Article 13. Whether by grace a higher knowledge of God can be obtained than by natural reason. Objection 1. It seems that by grace a higher knowledge of God is not obtained than by natural reason. For Dionysius says, De Mystica Theol 1, that whoever is the more united to God in this life is united to him as to one entirely unknown. He says the same of Moses, who nevertheless obtained a certain excellence by the knowledge conferred by grace. But to be united to God while ignoring of him what he is comes about also by natural reason. Therefore God is not more known to us by grace than by natural reason. Objection 2. Further, we can acquire the knowledge of divine things by natural reason only through the imagination, and the same applies to the knowledge given by grace. For Dionysius says, Coel Hied 1, that it is impossible for the divine ray to shine upon us, except as we screened round about by the many-colored sacred veils. Therefore, we cannot know God more fully by grace than by natural reason. Objection 3. Further, our intellect adheres to God by grace of faith, but faith does not seem to be knowledge, for Gregory says, Hom, XXVI, or I think that's 26 in EV, that things not seen are the objects of faith, and not of knowledge. Therefore, there is not given to us a more excellent knowledge of God by grace. On the contrary, the Apostle says, God hath revealed to us his Spirit, what none of the princes of this world knew. 1 Corinthians 2:10, namely the philosophers, as the gloss expounds. I answer that we have a more perfect knowledge of God by grace than by natural reason, which is proved thus. The knowledge which we have by natural reason contains two things: images derived from the sensible objects, and the natural intelligible light, enabling us to abstract from them intelligible conceptions. Now in both of these, human knowledge is assisted by the revelation of grace, for the intellect's natural light is strengthened by the infusion of gratuitous light, and sometimes also the images in the human imagination are divinely formed, so as to express divine things better than those do which we receive from sensible objects, as appears in prophetic visions, while sometimes sensible things or even voices are divine form are divinely formed to express some divine meaning, as in the baptism. The Holy Ghost was seen in the shape of a dove, and the voice of the Father was heard. This is my beloved Son. Matthew 3:17. Reply to objection 1. Although by the revelation of grace in this life we cannot know of God what he is, and thus are united to him as to one unknown, still we know him more fully according as many and more excellent of his effects are demonstrated to us, and according as we attribute to him some things known by divine revelation, to which natural reason cannot reach, as for instance, that God is three and not one. Reply to objection 2. From the images either received from sense in the natural order or divinely formed in the imagination, we have so much the more excellent intellectual knowledge. The stronger the intelligible light is in man, and thus through the revelation given by the images, a fuller knowledge is received by the infusion of the divine light. Reply to objection 3. Faith is a kind of knowledge, inasmuch as the intellect is determined by faith to some knowable object. But this determination to one object does not proceed from the vision of the believer, but from the vision of him who is believed. Thus, as far as faith falls short of vision, it falls short of the knowledge which belongs to science. For science determines the intellect to one object by the vision and understanding of first principles. Question 13. The names of God. Prologue. After the consideration of those things which belong to the divine knowledge, we now proceed to the consideration of the divine names, for everything is named by us according to our knowledge of it. Under this head, there are 12 points for inquiry. 1. Whether God can be named by us. 2. Whether any names applied to God are predicated of him substantially. 3. Whether any names applied to God are said of him literally or are all taken to be metaphorically. 4. Whether any names applied to God are synonymous. 5. Whether some names are applied to God and to creatures univocally or equivocally. 6. Whether, supposing they are applied analogically, they are applied first to God or to creatures. 7. Whether any names are applicable to God from time. 8. Whether this name God is a name of nature or of operation. 9. Whether this name God is a communicable name. 10. Whether it is taken univocally or equivocally as signifying God by nature, by participation, and by opinion. 11. Whether this name, who is the supremely appropriate name of God. 12. Whether affirmative propositions can be formed about God. Alright, Article 1. Whether a name can be given to God. Objection 1. It seems that no name can be given to God. For Dionysius says, Div. Nom. 1, that of him there is neither name nor can one be found of him. And it is written, What is his name, and what is the name of his son, if thou knowest? Proverbs 34. Objection 2. Further, every name is either abstract or concrete, but concrete names do not belong to God, since he is simple, nor do abstract names belong to him, forasmuch as they do not signify any perfect subsisting thing. Therefore no name can be said of God. Objection 3. Further, nouns are taken to signify substance with quality. Verbs and participles signify substance with time. Pronouns the same with demonstration or relation. But none of these can be applied to God, for he has no quality, nor accident, nor time. Moreover, he cannot be felt so as to be pointed out, nor can he be described by relation, inasmuch as relations serve to recall a thing mentioned before by nouns, participles, or demonstrative pronouns. Therefore, God cannot in any way be named by us. On the contrary, it is written, Exodus 15:3, The Lord is a man of war. Almighty is his name. I answer that, since according to the philosopher, Periherm, Book 1, words are signs of ideas, and ideas the similitude of things, it is evident that words relate to the meaning of things signified through the medium of the intellectual conception. It follows therefore that we can give a name to anything in far as we can understand it. Now it was shown above, question 12, articles 11, 12, that in this life we cannot see the essence of God, but we know God from creatures as their principle, and also by way of excellence and emotion. In this way, therefore, he can be named by us creatures, yet not so that the name which signifies him expresses the divine essence in itself. Thus, the name man expresses the essence of man in himself, since it signifies the definition of man by manifesting his essence, for the idea expressed by the name is the definition. Reply to objection 1. The reason why God has no name, or is said to be above being named, is because his essence is above all that we understand about God, and signify in word. Reply to objection 2. Because we know and name God from creatures, the names we attribute to God signify what belongs to material creatures, of which the knowledge is natural to us, and because in creatures of this kind what is perfect and subsistent is compound, whereas their form is not a complete subsisting thing, but rather is that whereby a thing is. Hence it follows that all names used by us to signify a complete subsisting thing must have a concrete meaning as applicable to compound things, whereas names given to signify simple forms signify a thing not as subsisting, but as that whereby a thing is. As for instance, whiteness signifies that whereby a thing is white, and as God is simple and subsisting, we attribute to him abstract names to signify his simplicity, and concrete names to signify his substance and perfection. Although both these kinds of names fail to express his mode of being, for as much as our intellect does not know him in this life as he is. Reply to objection 3. To signify substance with quality is to signify the suppositum, with a nature or determined form in which it subsists. Hence, as some things are said of God in a concrete sense to signify his subsistence and perfection, so likewise nouns are applied to God, signifying substance with quality. Further, verbs and participles which signify time are applied to him because his eternity includes all time. For as we can apprehend and signify simple substances only by way of compound things, so we can understand and express simple eternity only by way of temporal things, because our intellect has a natural affinity to compound and temporal things. But demonstrative pronouns are applied to God as describing what is understood, not what is sensed, for we can only describe him as far as we understand him. Thus, according as nouns, participles, and demonstrative pronouns are applicable to God, so far can he be signified by relative pronouns. Article 2. Whether any name can be applied to God substantially. Objection 1. It seems that no name can be applied to God substantially. For Damascene says, De Fide, Orth, Book 1, 9, everything said of God signifies not his substance, but rather shows forth what he is not, or expresses some relation, or something following from his nature or operation. Objection 2. Further, Dionysius says, Div Nom 1, you will find a chorus of holy doctors addressed to the end of distinguishing clearly and praiseworthily the divine possessions in the denomination of God. Thus, the names applied by the holy doctors in praising God are distinguished according to the divine processions themselves. But what expresses the procession of anything does not signify its essence. Therefore, the names applied to God are not said of him substantially. Objection 3. Further, a thing is named by us according as we understand it, but God is not understood by us in this life, in his substance. Therefore, neither is any name we can use applied substantially to God. On the contrary, Augustine says, De Trinitate 6, the being of God is the being strong, or being wise, or whatever else we may say of that simplicity whereby his substance is signified. Therefore all names of this kind signify the divine substance. I answer that negative names applied to God, or signifying his relation to creatures manifestly, do not at all signify his substance, but rather express the distance of the creature from him, or his relation to something else, or rather the relation of creatures to himself. But as regards absolute and affirmative names of God as good, wise, and the like, various and many opinions have been given. For some have said that all such names, although they are applied to God affirmatively, nevertheless have been brought into use more to express some emotion from God, rather than to express anything that exist positively in him. Hence they assert that when we say that God lives, we mean that God is not like an inanimate thing, and the same in the same in like manner applies to other names, and this was taught by Rabbi Moses. Others say that these names applied to God signify his relationship towards creatures. Thus, in the words God is good, we mean God is the cause of goodness in things, and the same rule applies to other names. Both of these opinions, however, seem to be untrue for three reasons. First, because in neither of them can a reason be assigned why some names more than others are applied to God, for he is assuredly the cause of bodies in the same way as he is the cause of good things. Therefore, if the words God is good signified no more than God is the cause of good things, it might in like manner be said that God is a body, inasmuch as he is the cause of bodies. So also to say that he is a body implies that he is not a mere potentiality as his primary matter. Excuse me, sorry. Secondly, because it would follow that all names applied to God would be said of him by way of being taken in a secondary sense, as healthy is secondarily said of medicine, forasmuch as it signifies only the cause of the health in the animal which primarily is called healthy. Thirdly, because this is against the intention of those who speak of God, for in saying that God lives, they assuredly mean more than to say he is the cause of our life, or that he differs from inanimate bodies. Therefore we must hold a different doctrine, viz., that these names signify the divine substance, and are predicated substantially of God. Although they fall short of a full representation of him, which is proved thus, for these names express God so far as our intellects know him. Now, since our intellect knows God from creatures, it knows him as far as creatures represent him. Now, it is shown above question 4 article 2 that God prepossesses in himself all the perfections of creatures, being himself simply and universally perfect. Hence every creature represents him, and is like him so far as it possesses some perfection. Yet it represents him not as something of the same species or genus, but as the excelling principle of whose form the effects fall short, although they derive some kind of likeness thereto, even as the forms of inferior bodies represent the power of the sun. This was explained above, question 4, article 3, in treating of the divine perfection. Therefore, the aforesaid names signify the divine substance, but in an imperfect manner, even as creatures represent it imperfectly. So when we say God is good, the meaning is not God is the cause of goodness, or God is not evil, but the meaning is whatever good we attribute to creatures pre-exists in God, and in a more excellent and higher way. Hence it does not follow that God is good because he causes goodness, but rather on the contrary, he causes goodness in things because he is good, according to what Augustine says, De Doctrine Christ, book 132. Because he is good, we are. Reply to objection 1. Damascene says that these names do not signify what God is, for as much as by none of these names is perfectly expressed what he is, but each one signifies him in an imperfect manner, even as creatures represent him imperfectly. Reply to objection 2. In the significance of names, that from which the name is derived is different sometimes from what it is intended to signify. As, for instance, this name, stone, lapis, is imposed from the fact that it hurts the foot, but it is not imposed to signify that which hurts the foot, but rather to signify a certain kind of body. Otherwise, everything that hurts the foot would be a stone. So we must say that these kinds of divine names are imposed from the divine possessions. For as according to the diverse possessions of their perfections, creatures are the representations of God, although in an imperfect manner. So likewise, our intellect knows and names God according to each kind of procession, but nevertheless these names are not imposed to signify the procession themselves, as if when we say God lives, the sense were life proceeds from him, but to signify the principle itself of things, insofar as life pre-exists in him, although it pre-exists in him in a more eminent way than can be understood or signified. Reply to Objection 3. We cannot know the essence of God in this life, as he really is in himself, but we know him accordingly as he is represented in the perfections of creatures, and thus the names imposed by us signify him in that manner only. Article 3. Whether any name can be applied to God in its literal sense. Objection 1. It seems that no name is applied literally to God, for all names which we apply to God are taken from creatures, as was explained above, Article 1. But the names of creatures are applied to God metaphorically, as when we say God is a stone, or a lion, or the like. Therefore names are applied to God in a metaphorical sense. Objection 2. Further, no name can be applied literally to anything if it should be withheld from it rather than given to it. But all such names as good, wise, and the like are more truly withheld from God than given to him, as appears from Dionysius says, Coelhier 2. Therefore, none of these names belong to God in their literal sense. Objection 3. Further, corporal names are applied to God in a metaphorical sense only, since he is incorporeal, but all such names imply some kind of corporal condition, for their meaning is bound up with time and composition and like corporal conditions. Therefore all these names are applied to God in a metaphorical sense. On the contrary, Ambrose says, De Fide 2, some names there are which express evidently the property of the divinity, and some which express the clear truth of the divine majesty. But others there are which are applied to God metaphorically by way of similitude. Therefore, not all names are applied to God in a metaphorical sense, but there are some which are said of him in their literal sense. I answer that, according to the preceding article, our knowledge of God is derived from the perfections which flow from him to creatures, which perfections are in God in a more eminent way than in creatures. Now our intellect apprehends them as they are in creatures, and as it apprehends them, it signifies them by names. Therefore, as to the names applied to God, viz., the perfections which they signify, such as goodness, life, and the like, and their mode of signification. As regards what is signified by these names, they belong properly to God, and more properly than they belong to creatures, and are applied primarily to him. But as regards their mode of signification, they do not properly and strictly apply to God, for their mode of signification applies to creatures. Reply to Objection 1. There are some names which signify these perfections flowing from God to creatures, in such a way that the imperfect way in which creatures receive the divine perfection is part of the very signification of the name itself, as stone signifies a material being, and names of this kind can be applied to God only in a metaphorical sense. Other names, however, express these perfections absolutely, without any such mode of participation, being part of their signification as the words being, good, living, and the like, and such names can be literally applied to God. Reply to Objection 2. Such names as these, as Dionysius shows, are denied of God for the reason that what the name signifies does not belong to him in the ordinary sense of its signification, but in a more eminent way. Hence Dionysius says also that God is above all substance and all life. Reply to Objection 3. These names which are applied to God literally imply corporal conditions not in the thing signified, but as regards their mode of signification, whereas those which are applied to God metaphorically imply and mean a corporal condition in the thing signified. Article 4. Whether names applied to God are synonymous. Objection 1. It seems that these names applied to God are synonymous names, for synonymous names are those which mean exactly the same. But these names applied to God mean entirely the same thing in God, for the goodness of God is his essence, and likewise it is his wisdom. Therefore these names are entirely synonymous. Objection 2. Further, if it be said these names signify one and the same thing in reality, but differ in idea, it can be objected that an idea to which no reality corresponds is a vain notion. Therefore, if these ideas are many and the thing is one, it seems also that all these ideas are vain notions. Objection 3. Further, a thing which is one in reality and in idea is more than one what is one in reality and many in idea. But God is supremely one. Therefore it seems that he is not one in reality and many in idea, and thus the names applied to God do not signify different ideas, and thus they are synonymous. On the contrary, all synonyms united with each other are redundant, as when we say vesture, clothing. Therefore, if all names applied to God are synonymous, we cannot properly say good God, or the like, and yet it is written, O most mighty, great, and powerful, the Lord of hosts is thy name. Jeremiah 32:18. I answer that these names spoken of God are not synonymous. This would be easy to understand if we said that these names are used to remove or to express the relation of cause to creatures, for thus it would follow that there are different ideas as regards the diverse things denied of God, or as regards diverse effects connoted. But even according to what was said above, Article 2, that these names signify the divine substance, although in an imperfect manner, it is also clear from what has been said, Articles 1, 2, that they have diverse meanings. For the idea signified by the name is the conception in the intellect of the thing signified by the name. But our intellect, since it knows God from creatures, in order to understand God, forms conceptions proportional to the perfections flowing from God to creatures, which perfections pre-exist in God unitedly and simply, whereas in creatures they are received and divided and multiplied. As therefore to the different perfections of creatures, there corresponds one simple principle represented by different perfections of creatures in a various and manifold manner, so also to the various and multiplied conceptions of our intellect. There corresponds one altogether simple principle according to these conceptions, imperfectly understood. Therefore, although the names applied to God signify one thing, still, because they signify that under many and different aspects they are not synonymous. Thus appears the solution of the first objection. Since synonymous terms signify one thing under one aspect, for words which signify different aspects of one thing do not signify primarily and absolutely one thing, because the term only signifies the thing through the medium of the intellectual conception, as was said above. Reply to objection 2. The many aspects of these names are not empty and vain, for there corresponds to all of them one simple reality represented by them in a manifold and imperfect manner. Reply to objection 3. The perfect unity of God requires that what are manifold and divided in others should exist in him simply and unitedly. Thus, it comes about that he is one in reality, and yet multiple in idea, because our intellect apprehends him in a manifold manner, as things represent him. Article 5. Whether what is said of God and of creatures is univocally predicated of them. Objection 1. It seems that the things attributed to God and creatures are univocal, for every equivocal term is reduced to the univocal, as many are reduced to one. For if the name dog be said equivocally of the barking dog and of the dog fish, it must be said of some univocally, viz. Of all barking dogs. Otherwise we proceed to infinitude. Now there are some univocal agents which agree with their effects in name and definition, as man generates man, and there are some agents which are equivocal, as the sun which causes heat, although the sun is hot only in an equivocal sense. Therefore it seems that the first agent, to which all other agents are reduced, is an univocal agent, and thus what is said of God and creatures is predicated univocally. Objection 2. Further, there is no similitude among equivocal things. Therefore, as creatures have a certain likeness to God, according to the word of Genesis 1:26, let us make man to our image and likeness. It seems that something can be said of God and creatures univocally. Objection 3. Further, measure is homogeneous with the thing measured, but God is the first measure of all beings. Therefore God is homogeneous with creatures, and thus a word may be applied univocally to God and to creatures. On the contrary, whatever is predicated of various things under the same name but not in the same sense is predicated equivocally. But no name belongs to God in the same sense that it belongs to creatures. For instance, wisdom in creatures is a quality, but not in God. Now a different genus changes in essence, since the genus is part of the definition, and the same applies to other things. Therefore, whatever is said of God and of creatures is predicated equivocally. Further, God is more distant from creatures than any creatures are from each other, but the distance of some creatures make any univocal predication of them impossible, as in the case of those things which are not in the same genus. Therefore, much less can be anything Therefore much less can anything be predicated univocally of God and creatures, and so only equivocal predication can be applied to them. I answer that univocal predication is impossible between God and creatures. The reason of this is that every effect which is not an adequate result of the power of the efficient cause receives the similitude of the agent not in its full degree, but in a measure that falls short, so that what is divided and multiplied in the effects resides in the agent simply, and in the same manner as, for example, the sun by exercise of its one power produces manifold and various forms in all inferior things. In the same way, as said in the preceding article, all perfections existing in creatures divided and multiplied pre-exist in God unitedly. Thus, when any term expressing perfection is applied to a creature, it signifies that perfection distinct in idea from other perfections. As, for instance, by the term wise applied to man, we signify some perfection distinct from a man's essence, and distinct from his power and existence, and from all similar things. Whereas when we apply it to God, we do not mean to signify anything distinct from his essence or power or existence. Thus, also this term wise, applied to man in some degree, circumscribes and comprehends the thing signified. Whereas this is not the case when it is applied to God, but it leaves the thing signified as incomprehended, and as exceeding the signification of the same. Hence, it is evident that this term wise is not applied in the same way to God and to man. The same rule applies to other terms. Hence, no name is predicated univocally of God and of creatures. Neither, on the other hand, are names applied to God and creatures in a purely equivocal sense, as some have said. Because if that were so, it follows that from creatures nothing could be known or demonstrated about God at all. For the reasoning would always be exposed to the fallacy of equivocation. Such a view is against the philosophers, who proved many things about God, and also against what the Apostle says. The invisible things of God are clearly seen, being understood by the things that are made. Romans 1:20. Therefore, it must be said that these names are said of God and creatures in an analogous sense, that is, according to proportion. Now, names are thus used in two ways, either according as many things are proportionate to one. Thus, for example, healthy, predicated of medicine, and urine in relation and in proportion to health of a body, of which the former is the sign and the latter the cause, or according as one thing is proportionate to another. Thus, healthy is said of medicine and animal, since medicine is the cause of health in the animal body. And in this way, some things are said of God and creatures analogically, and not in a purely equivocal nor in a purely univocal sense. For we can name God only from creatures. Article 1. Thus, whatever is said of God and creatures is said according to the relation of a creature to God as its principle and cause, wherein all perfections of things pre-exist excellently. Now, this mode of community of idea is a mean between pure equivocation and simple univocation. For in analogies, the idea is not, as it is in univocals, one and the same. Yet it is not totally diverse as in equivocals, but a term which is thus used in a multiple sense signifies various proportions to some one thing. Thus, healthy, applied to urine, signifies the sign of animal health, and applied to medicine, signifies the cause of the same health. Reply to objection 1. Although equivocal predications must be reduced to univocal, still in actions, the non-univocal agent must precede the univocal agent. For the non-univocal agent is the universal cause of the whole species. As for instance, the sun is the cause of the generation of all men, whereas the univocal agent is not the universal efficient cause of the whole species. Otherwise, it would be the cause of itself, since it is contained in the species. But it is a particular cause of this individual which it places under the species by way of participation. Therefore, the universal cause of the whole species is not an univocal agent, and the universal cause comes before the particular cause. But this universal agent, whilst it is not univocal, nevertheless it is not altogether equivocal. Otherwise, it cannot produce its own likeness, but rather it is to be called an analogical agent, as all univocal predications are reduced to one first non-univocal analogical predication, which is being. Reply to objection 2. The likeness of the creature to God is imperfect, for it does not represent one and the same generic thing. Question 4, Article 3. Reply to Objection 3. God is not the measure proportioned to things measured, hence it is not necessary that God and creatures should be in the same genus. The arguments adduced in the contrary sense prove indeed that these names are not predicated univocally of God and creatures, yet they do not prove that they are predicated equivocally. Article 6. Whether names predicated of God are predicated primarily of creatures. Objection 1. It seems that names are predicated primarily of creatures rather than of God, for we name anything accordingly as we know it, since names, as the philosopher says, are signs of ideas, but we know creatures before we know God. Therefore the names imposed by us are predicated primarily of creatures rather than of God. Objection 2. Further, Dionysius says, Div. Nom. Book 1, we name God from creatures, but names transferred from creatures to God are said primarily of creatures rather than of God, as lion, stone, and the like. Therefore all names applied to God and creatures are applied primarily to creatures rather than to God. Objection 3. Further, all names are equally applied to God and creatures are applied to God as the cause of all creatures. As Dionysius says, de mystica theo, but what is applied to anything through its cause is applied to it secondarily. For healthy is primarily predicated of animal rather than of medicine, which is the cause of health. Therefore, these names are said primarily of creatures rather than of God. On the contrary, it is written, I bow my knees to the Father of our Lord Jesus Christ, of whom all paternity in heaven and earth is named. Ephesians 3:14-15. And the same applies to the other names applied to God and creatures. Therefore these names are applied primarily to God rather than to creatures. I answer that, in names predicated of many in an analogical sense, all are predicated because they have reference to some one thing, and this one thing must be placed in the definition of them all. And since that expressed by the name is the definition, as the philosopher says, Metaphysics 6, such a name must be applied primarily to that which is put in the definition of such other things, and secondarily to these others, according as they approach more or less to that first. Thus, for instance, healthy applied to animals comes into the definition of healthy applied to medicine, which is called healthy as being the cause of health in the animal, and also into the definition of healthy which is applied to urine, which is called healthy insofar as it is the sign of the animal's health. Thus, all names applied metaphorically to all names applied metaphorically to God are applied to creatures primarily, rather than to God, because when said of God they mean only similitudes to such creatures. For as smiling applied to a field means only that the field in the beauty of its flowering is like the beauty of the human smile by proportionate likeness, so the name of lion applied to God means only that God manifests strength in his works, as a lion in his. Thus it is said that applied to God the signification of names can be defined only from what is said of creatures. But to other names not applied to God in a metaphorical sense, the same rule would apply if they were spoken of God as the cause only, as some have supposed. For when it is said, God is good, it would then only mean God is the cause of the creature's goodness. Thus the term good applied to God would included in its meaning the creature's goodness. Hence, good would apply primarily to creatures rather than to God. But as was shown above, Article 2, these names are applied to God not as the cause only, but also essentially. For the words God is good or wise signify not only that he is the cause of wisdom or goodness, but that these exist in him in a more excellent way. Hence, as regards what the name signifies, these names are applied primarily to God rather than to creatures, because these perfections flow from God to creatures. But as regards the imposition of the names, they are primarily applied by us to creatures which we know first. Hence they have a mode of signification which belongs to creatures, as said above, Article 3. Reply to Objection 1. This objection refers to the imposition of the name. Reply to Objection 2. The same rule does not apply to metaphorical and to other names, as said above. Reply to Objection 3. This objection would be valid if these names were applied to God only as cause, but not also essentially. For instance, as healthy is applied to medicine. Article 7. Whether names which imply relation to creatures are predicated of God temporally. Objection 1. It seems that names which imply relation to creatures are not predicated of God temporally. For all such names signify the divine substance, as is universally held. Hence also Ambrose de Fide 1, that this name, Lord, is the name of power, which is the divine substance, and Creator signifies the action of God, which is his essence. Now, the divine substance is not temporal, but eternal. Therefore, these names are not applied to God temporally, but eternally. Objection 2. Further, that to which something applies temporally can be described as made. For what is white temporally is made white, but to make does not apply to God. Therefore, nothing can be predicated of God temporally. Objection 3. Further, if any names are applied to God temporally as implying relation to creatures, the same rule holds good of all things that imply relation to creatures. But some names are spoken of God implying relation of God to creature from eternity. For from eternity he knew and loved the creature, according to the word, I have loved thee with an everlasting love. Jeremiah 31:3. Therefore, also other names implying relation to creatures, as Lord and Creator, are applied to God from eternity. Objection 4. Further, names of this kind signify relation. Therefore, that relation must be something in God, or in the creature only. But it cannot be that it is something in the creature only, for in that case God would be called Lord from the opposite relation which is in creatures, and nothing is named from its opposite. Therefore the relation must be something in God also, but nothing temporal can be in God, for he is above time. Therefore these names are not applied to God temporally. Objection 5. Further, a thing is called relative from relation. For instance, Lord from lordship, as white from whiteness. Therefore, if the relation of lordship is not really in God, but only in idea, it follows that God is not really Lord, which is plainly false. Objection 6. Further, in relative things which are not simultaneous in nature, one can exist without the other, as a thing knowable can exist without the knowledge of it, as the philosopher says, Predic 5. But relative things which are said of God and creatures are not simultaneous in nature. Therefore, a relation can be predicated of God to the creature even without the existence of the creature, and thus these names Lord and Creator are predicated of God from eternity and not temporally. On the contrary, Augustine says, De Trinitate 5, that this relative appellation, Lord, is applied to God temporally. I answer that the names which import relation to creatures are applied to God temporally, and not from eternity. To see this, we must learn that some have said that relation is not a reality, but only an idea. But this is plainly seen to be false from the very fact that things themselves have a mutual natural order and habitude. Nevertheless, it is necessary to know that since relation has two extremes, it happens in three ways, that a relation is real or logical. Sometimes from both extremes it is an idea only, as when mutual order or habitude can only go between things in the apprehension of reason, as when we say a thing the same as itself, for reason apprehending one thing twice regards it as two. Thus it apprehends a certain habitude of a thing to itself. And the same applies to relations between being and non-being, formed by reason, apprehending non-being as an extreme. The same is true of relations that follow upon an act of reason, as genus and species and the like. Now there are other relations which are realities, as regards both extremes, as when, for instance, a habitude exists between two things according to some reality that belongs to both, as is clear of all relations, consequent upon quantity, as great and small, double and half, and the like, for quantity exists in both extremes, and the same applies to relations, consequent upon action and passion, as motive power and the movable thing, father and son, and the like. Again, sometimes a relation in one extreme may be a reality, while in the other extreme it is an idea only, and this happens whenever two extremes are not of one order, as sense and science refer respectively to sensible things and to intellectual things, which inasmuch as they are realities existing in nature are outside the order of sensible and intellectual existence. Therefore in science and in sense a real relation exists, because they are ordered either to the knowledge or to the sensible perception of things, whereas the things looked at in themselves are outside this order, and hence in them there is no real relation to science and sense, but only an idea, inasmuch as the intellect apprehends them as terms of the relations of science and sense. Hence the philosopher says, Metaphysics 5, that they are called relative, not for as much as they are related to other things, but as others are related to them. Likewise, for instance, on the right is not applied to a column, unless it stands as regards an animal on the right side, which relation is not really in the column, but in the animal. Since therefore God is outside the whole order of creation, and all creatures are ordered to him, and not conversely, it is manifest that creatures are really related to God himself, whereas in God there is no real relation to creatures, but a relation only in idea, inasmuch as creatures are referred to him. Thus there is nothing to prevent these names, which import relation to the creature, from being predicated of God temporally, not by reason of any change in him, but by reason of the change of the creature, as a column is on the right of an animal, without change in itself, but by change in the animal. Reply to Objection 1. Some relative names are imposed to signify the relative habitudes themselves, as master and servant, father and son, and the like, and these relatives are called predicamental, secundum esse, but others are imposed to signify the things from which ensue certain habitudes, as the mover and the thing moved, the head and the thing that has a head, and the like, and these relatives are called transcendental, secundum disi. Thus, there is the same twofold difference in divine names, for some signify the habitude itself to the creature, as Lord, and these do not signify the divine substance directly, but indirectly, insofar as they presuppose the divine substance, as dominion presupposes power, which is the divine substance. Others signify the divine essence directly, and consequently the corresponding habitudes, as Savior, Creator, and such like. And these signify the action of God, which is his essence. Yet both names are said of God temporarily, so far as they imply a habitude, either principally or consequently, but not as signifying the essence either directly or indirectly. Reply to Objection 2. As relations applied to God temporally are only in God in our idea, so to become or to be made are applied to God only in idea, with no change in him. As for instance, when we say, Lord, thou art become our refuge, Psalms 89:1. Reply to Objection 3. The operation of the intellect and the will is in the operator. Therefore, names signifying relations following upon the action of the intellect or will are applied to God from eternity, whereas those following upon the actions proceeding according to our mode of thinking to external effects are applied to God temporally, as Savior, Creator, and the like. Reply to Objection 4. Relations signified by these names, which are applied to God temporally, are in God only in idea, but the opposite relations in creatures are real. Nor is it incongruous that God should be denominated from relations really existing in the thing, yet so that the opposite relations in God should also be understood by us at the same time, in the sense that God is spoken of relatively to the creature, inasmuch as the creature is related to him. Thus, the philosopher says, Metaphysics 5, that the object is said to be knowable relatively because knowledge relates to it. Reply to Objection 5. Since God is related to the creature for the reason that the creature is related to him, and since the relation of subjection is real in the creature, it follows that God is Lord not in idea only, but in reality, for he is called Lord according to the manner in which the creature is subject to him. Reply to Objection 6. To know whether relations are simultaneous by nature or otherwise, it is not necessary by nature or otherwise of things to which they belong, but the meaning of the relations themselves. For if one in its idea includes another and vice versa, then they are simultaneous by nature, as double and half, father and son, and the like. But if one in its idea includes another and not vice versa, they are not simultaneous by nature. This applies to science and its object, for the object knowable is considered as a potentiality, and the science as a habit or as an act. Hence, the knowable object in its mode of signification exists before science, but if the same object is considered an act, then it is simultaneous with science and act. For the object known is nothing as such unless it is known. Thus, though God is prior to the creature, still, because the signification of Lord includes the idea of a servant and vice versa, these two relative terms, Lord and servant, are simultaneous by nature. Hence, God was not Lord until he had a creature subject to himself. Article 8. Whether this name God is a name of the nature. Objection 1. It seems that this name God is not a name of the nature. For Damascene says, De fide, orth, 1, that God, Theos, is so called from the thein, and to cherish all things, or from the athein, that is to burn. For our God is a fire, consuming all malice, or from theasthai, which means to consider all things. But all these names belong to operation, since this name, God, signifies his operation, not his nature. Further, a thing is named by us as we know it, but the divine nature is unknown to us. Therefore, this name God does not signify the divine nature. On the contrary, Ambrose says, De fide 1, that God is a name of the nature. I answer that, whence a name is imposed, and what the name signifies are not always the same thing. For as we know substance from its properties and operations, so we name substance sometimes for its operation, or its property. For example, we name the substance of a stone from its act, as for instance that it hurts the foot. But still, this name is not meant to signify the particular action, but the stone's substance. The things, on the other hand, known to us in themselves, such as heat, cold, whiteness, and the like, are not named from other things. Hence, as regards such things, the meaning of the name and its source are the same. Because therefore God is not known to us in his nature, but is made known to us from his operations or effects, we name him from these, as said in Article 1. Hence this name, God, is a name of operation, so far as relates to the source of its meaning. For this name is imposed from his universal providence over all things, since all who speak of God intend to name God as exercising providence over all. Hence, Dionysius says, Div Nom 2, the deity watches over all with perfect providence and goodness. But taken from this operation, this name, God, is imposed to signify the divine nature. Reply to Objection 1. All that Damascene says refers to providence, which is the source of the signification of the name God. Reply to Objection 2. We can name a thing according to the knowledge we have of its nature from its properties and effects. Hence, because we can know what stone is in itself from its property, this name stone signifies the nature of the stone itself, for it signifies the definition of stone, by which we know what it is. For the idea which the name signifies is the definition, as is said in Metaphysics 4. Now, from the divine effects, we cannot know the divine nature in itself, so as to know what it is, but only by way of eminence, and by way of causality and of negation, as stated above, question 12, article 12. Thus, the name God signifies the divine nature, for this name was imposed to signify something existing above all things, the principle of all things, and removed from all things. For those who name God intend to signify all this. Article 9. Whether this name God is communicable. Objection 1. It seems that this name God is communicable, for whosoever shares in the thing signified by a name shares in the name itself. But this name God signifies the divine nature, which is communicable to others, according to the words, He hath given us great and precious promises, that by these we may be made partakers of the divine nature. 2 Pt 1:4. I think that's Peter. Therefore, this name, God, can be communicated to others. Objection 2. Further, only proper names are not communicable. Now this name, God, is not a proper, but an appellative noun, which appears from the fact that it has a plural according to the text. I have said You are gods. Psalm 81:6. Therefore, this name God is communicable. Objection 3. Further, this name God comes from operation, as explained, but other names given to God from his operations or effects are communicable, as good, wise, and the like. Therefore, this name God is communicable. On the contrary, it is written, they gave the incommunicable name to wood and stones. Wisdom 14:21. In reference to the divine name, therefore this name God is incommunicable. I answer that a name is communicable in two ways, properly and by similitude. It is properly communicable in the sense that its whole signification can be given to many. By similitude, it is communicable according to some part of the signification of the name. For instance, this name lion is properly communicable to all things of the same nature as lion. By similitude, it is communicable to those who participate in the nature of a lion, as for instance by courage or strength, and those who thus participate are called lions metaphorically. To know, however, what names are properly communicable, we must consider that every form existing in the singular subject, by which it is individualized, is common to many either in reality or in idea, as human nature is common to many in reality and in idea, whereas the nature of the sun is not common to many in reality but only in idea. For the nature of the sun can be understood as existing in many subjects, and the reason is because the mind understands the nature of every species by abstraction from the singular. Hence, to be in one singular subject or in many is outside the idea of the nature of the species. So given the idea of a species, it can be understood as existing in many. But the singular, from the fact that it is singular, is divided off from all others. Hence every name imposed to signify any singular thing is incommunicable, both in reality and in idea. For the plurality of this individual thing cannot be, nor can it be conceived in idea. Hence no name signifying any individual thing is properly communicable to many, but only by way of similitude. As for instance, a person can be called Achilles metaphorically, forasmuch as he may possess something of the properties of Achilles, such as strength. On the other hand, forms which are individualized, not by any suppositum, but by and of themselves, as being subsisting forms, if understood as they are in themselves, could not be communicable either in reality or in idea, but only perhaps by way of similitude, as was said of individuals. Forasmuch as we are unable to understand simple self-subsisting forms as they really are, we understand them as compound things, having forms in matter. Therefore, as was said in the first article, we give them concrete names signifying a nature existing in some suppositum. Hence, so far as concerns images, the same rules apply to names we impose to signify the nature of compound things, as to names given to us to signify simple subsisting natures. Since then, this name God is given to signify the divine nature, as stated above Article 8, and since the divine nature cannot be multiplied as was shown above, question 11, Article 3, it follows that this name God is incommunicable in reality, but communicable in opinion, just in the same way as this name Son would be communicable according to the opinion of those who say there are many sons. Therefore, it is written, you served them who by nature are not gods, Galatians 4:8, and a gloss adds, gods not in nature, but in human opinion. Nevertheless, this name God is communicable, not in its whole signification, but in some part of it by way of similitude, so that those are called God who share in divinity by likeness, according to the text, I have said you are gods. Psalm 81:6. But if any name were given to signify God, not as to his nature, but as to his suppositum, accordingly as he is considered as this something, that name would be absolutely incommunicable, as for instance, perhaps the tetragrammaton among the Hebrew, and this is like giving a name to the sun as signifying this individual thing. Reply to objection 1. The divine nature is only communicable according to the participation of some similitude. Reply to objection 2. This name God is an appellative name, and not a proper name, for it signifies the divine nature in the possessor, although God himself in reality is neither universal nor particular, for names do not follow upon the mode of being in themselves, but upon the mode of being as it is in our mind, and yet it is incommunicable according to the truth of the thing, as was said above concerning the name Son. Reply to objection 3. These names, good, wise, and the like, are imposed from the perfections proceeding from God to creatures, but they do not signify the divine nature, but rather signify the perfections themselves absolutely, and therefore they are in truth communicable to many. But this name God is given to God from his own proper operation, which we experience continually to signify the divine nature. Article 10. Whether this name God is applied to God univocally by nature, by participation, and according to opinion. Objection 1. It seems that this name God is applied to God univocally by nature, by participation, and according to opinion. For where a diverse signification exists, there is no contradiction of affirmation and negation. For equivocation prevents contradiction, but a Catholic who says, an idol is not God, contradicts a pagan who says, an idol is God. Therefore God in both senses is spoken of univocally. Objection 2. Further, as an idol is God in opinion and not in truth, so the enjoyment of carnal pleasures is called happiness in opinion but not in truth. But this name beatitude is applied univocally to this supposed happiness, and also to true happiness. Therefore, also this name God is applied univocally to the true God, and to God also in opinion. Objection 3. Further, names are called univocal because they contain one idea. Now when a Catholic says there is one God, he understands by the name God an omnipotent being, and one venerated above all, while the heathen understands the same when he says an idol is God. Therefore this name God is applied univocally to both. On the contrary, the idea in the intellect is the likeness of what is in the thing, as it is said in Peri Herm. 1. But the word animal applied to a true animal and to a picture of one is equivocal. Therefore this name God applied to the true God, and to God in opinion is applied equivocally. Further, no one can signify what he does not know, but the heathen does not know the divine nature. So when he says an idol is God, he does not signify the true deity. On the other hand, a Catholic signifies the true deity when he says that there is one God. Therefore this name God is not applied univocally but equivocally to the true God, and to God according to opinion. I answer that this name God in the three aforesaid significations is taken neither univocally nor equivocally, but analogically. This is apparent from this reason. Univocal terms mean absolutely the same thing, but equivocal terms absolutely different. Whereas in analogical terms, a word taken in one signification must be placed in the definition of the same word taken in other senses. As for instance, being, which is applied to substance, is placed in the definition of being as applied to accident, and healthy, applied to animal, is placed in the definition of healthy as applied to urine and medicine. For urine is the sign of health in the animal, and medicine is the cause of health. The same applies to the question at issue, for this name God, as signifying the true God, includes the idea of God when it is used to denote God in opinion or participation. For when we name anyone God by participation, we understand by the name of God some likeness of the true God. Likewise, when we call an idol God, by this name God we understand and signify something which men think is God. Thus it is manifest that the name has different meanings, but that one of them is comprised in the other significations. Hence it is manifestly said analogically. Reply to objection 1. The multiplication of names does not depend on the predication of the name, but on the signification. For this name man, of whomsoever it is predicated, whether truly or falsely, is predicated in one sense, but it would be multiplied if by the name man we meant to signify different things. For instance, if one meant to signify by this name man what man really is, and another meant to signify by the same name a stone or something else. Hence it is evident that a Catholic saying that an idol is not God contradicts the pagan asserting that it is God, because each of them uses this name God to signify the true God. For when the pagan says an idol is God, he does not use this name as meaning God in opinion, for he would then speak the truth, as also Catholics sometimes use the name in the sense, as in the Psalm, all gods of the Gentiles are demons. Psalms 95:5. The same remark applies to the second and third objections, for these reasons proceed from the different predication of the name, and not from its various significations. Reply to objection 4. The term animal, applied to a true and a pictured animal, is not purely equivocal, for the philosopher takes equivocal names in a large sense, including analogous names, because also being, which is predicated analogically, is sometimes said to be predicated equivocally or of different predicaments. Reply to objection 5. Neither a Catholic nor a pagan knows the very nature of God as it is in itself, but each one knows it according to some idea of causality or excellence or remotion. Question 12, Article 12. So a pagan can take this name God in the same way when he says an idol is God, as the Catholic does in saying an idol is not God. But if any one should be quite ignorant of God altogether, he could not even name him, unless perhaps, as we use names, the meaning of which we know not. Article 11. Whether this name, He who is the most proper name of God. Objection 1. It seems that this name, He who is not the most proper name of God. For this name, God, is an incommunicable name, but this name, He who is not an incommunicable name. Therefore, this name, He who is not the most proper name of God. Objection 2. Further, Dionysius says, Div Nom, Book 3, that the name of good excellently manifests all the possessions of God. But it especially belongs to God to be the universal principle of all things. Therefore, this name good is supremely proper to God, and not this name, He who is. Objection 3. Further, every divine name seems to imply relation to creatures, for God is known to us only through creatures. But this name, He who is, imports no relation to creatures. Therefore, this name, He who is not the most applicable to God. On the contrary, it is written that when Moses asked, if they should say to me, what is his name? What shall I say to them? The Lord answered him, Thus shalt thou say to them, He who is hath sent me to you. Exodus 3:13-14. Therefore, this name, He who is, most properly belongs to God. I answer that this name, He who is most properly applied to God for 3 reasons. First, because of its signification, for it does not signify form, but simply existence itself. Hence, since the existence of God is His essence itself, which can be said of no other, question 3, Article 4, it is clear that among other names this one especially denominates God, for everything is denominated by its form. Secondly, on account of its universality, for all other names are either less universal, or, if convertible with it, add something above it, at least in idea. Hence, in a certain way they inform and determine it. Now our intellect cannot know the essence of God itself in this life, as it is in itself. But whatever mode it applies in determining what it understands about God, it falls short of the mode of what God is in Himself. Therefore, the less determinate the names are, and the more universal and absolute they are, the more properly they are applied to God. Hence, Damascene says, De Fide, or 1, that He who is the principle of all names applied to God. For comprehending all in itself, it contains existence itself as an infinite and indeterminate sea of substance. Now, by any other name, some mode of substance is determined, whereas this name, He who is, determines no mode of being, but is indeterminate to all, and therefore it denominates the infinite ocean of substance. Thirdly, from its consignification, for it signifies present existence. And this above all properly applies to God, whose existence knows not past or future, as Augustine says, De Trinitate 5. Reply to objection 1. This name, He who is the name of God more properly than this name God, as regards its source, namely existence, and as regards the mode of signification and consignification, as said above. But as regards the object intended by the name, this name God is more proper, as it is imposed to signify the divine nature, and still more proper is the tetragrammaton, imposed to signify the substance of God itself, incommunicable, and, if one may so speak, singular. Reply to objection 2. This name, good, is the principal name of God, insofar as He is a cause, but not absolutely, for existence considered absolutely comes before the idea of cause. Reply to objection 3. It is not necessary that all the divine names should import relation to creatures, but it suffices that they be imposed from some perfections flowing from God to creatures. Among these, the first is existence, from which comes this name, He who is. Article 12. Whether affirmative propositions can be formed about God. Objection 1. It seems that affirmative propositions cannot be formed about God. For Dionysius says Koer Hied, Book 2, that negations about God are true, but affirmations are vague. Objection 2. Further, Boethius says De Trinitate 2, not De Trinitate, sorry, it's De Trin 2, that a simple form cannot be a subject, but God is the most absolutely simple form, as shown above. Question 3. My bad. Therefore, he cannot be a subject, but everything about which an affirmative proposition is made is taken as a subject. Therefore, an affirmative proposition cannot be formed about God. Objection 3. Further, every intellect is false which understands a thing otherwise than as it is. But God has existence without any composition as shown above. Question 3, Article 7. Therefore, since every affirmative intellect understands something as compound, it follows that a true affirmative proposition about God cannot be made. On the contrary, what is of faith cannot be false, but some affirmative propositions are of faith, as that God is three in one, and that he is omnipotent. Therefore, true affirmative propositions can be formed about God. I answer that true affirmative propositions can be formed about God. To prove this, we must know that in every true affirmative proposition, the predicate and the subject signify in some way the same thing in reality, and different things in idea. And this appears to be the case both in propositions which have an accidental predicate, and in those which have an essential predicate. For it is manifest that man and white are the same in subject, and different in idea. For the idea of man is one thing, and that of whiteness is another. The same applies when I say man is an animal, since the same thing which is man is truly animal, for in the same suppositum there is sensible nature by reason of which he is called man. Hence, here again predicate and subject are the same as to suppositum, but different as to idea. But in propositions where one same thing is predicated of itself, the same rule in some way applies, inasmuch as the intellect draws to the suppositum what it places in the subject. And what it places in the predicate, it draws to the nature of the form existing in the suppositum, according to the saying that predicates are to be taken formally and subjects materially. To this diversity in idea corresponds the plurality of predicate and subject, while the intellect signifies the identity of the thing by the composition itself. God, however, as considered in himself, is altogether one and simple, yet our intellect knows him by different conceptions because it cannot see him as he is in himself. Nevertheless, although it understands him under different conceptions, it knows that one and the same simple object corresponds to its conceptions. Therefore, the plurality of predicate and subject represents the plurality of idea, and the intellect represents the unity by composition. Reply to Objection 1. Dionysius says that the affirmations about God are vague, or according to another translation, incongruous, inasmuch as no name can be applied to God according to its mode of signification. Reply to Objection 2. Our intellect cannot comprehend simple subsisting forms as they really are in themselves, but it apprehends them as compound things in which there is something taken as subject and something that is inherent. Therefore, it apprehends the simple form as a subject, and attributes something else to it. Reply to Objection 3. This proposition, the intellect understanding anything otherwise than it is false, can be taken in two senses, accordingly as this adverb can be taken in two senses. Accordingly as this adverb, otherwise, determines the word understanding, on the part of the thing understood, or on the part of the one who understands. Taken as referring to the thing understood, the proposition is true, and the meaning is, any intellect which understands that this thing is otherwise than it is false. But this does not hold in the present case, because our intellect, when forming a proposition about God, does not affirm that he is composite, but that he is simple. But taken as referring to the one who understands, the proposition is false. For the mode of the intellect in understanding is different from the mode of the thing in its essence, since it is clear that our intellect understands material things below itself in an immaterial manner, not that it understands them to be immaterial things, but its manner of understanding is immaterial. Likewise, when it understands simple things above itself, it understands them according to its own mode, which is in a composite manner, yet not so as to understand them to be composite things, and thus our intellect is not false in forming composition in its ideas concerning God. Question 14 of God's knowledge. Prologue. Having considered what belongs to the divine substance, we have now to treat of God's operation. And since one kind of operation is immanent, and another kind of operation proceeds to the exterior effect, we treat first of knowledge and of will. For understanding abides in the intelligent agent, and will is in the one who wills, and afterwards of the power of God, the principle of the divine operation as proceeding to the exterior effect. Now because to understand is a kind of life, after treating of the divine knowledge, we consider truth and falsehood. Further, as everything known is in the knower, and the types of things as existing in the knowledge of God are called ideas, to the consideration of knowledge will be added the treatment of ideas. Concerning knowledge, there are 16 points for inquiry. 1. Whether there is knowledge in God. 2. Whether God understands himself. And 3. Whether he comprehends himself. 4. Whether his understanding is his substance. 5. Whether he understands other things besides himself. 6. Whether he has a proper knowledge of them. 7. Whether the knowledge of God is discursive. 8. Whether the knowledge of God is the cause of things. 9. Whether God has knowledge of non-existing things. 10. Whether he has knowledge of evil. 11. Whether he has knowledge of individual things. And 12. Whether he knows the infinite. 13. Whether he knows future contingent things. 14. Whether he knows enunciable things. 15. Whether the knowledge of God is variable. And 16. Whether God has speculative or practical knowledge of things. Article 1. Whether there is knowledge. Objection 1. It seems that in God there is not knowledge, for knowledge is a habit, and habit does not belong to God, since it is the mean between potentiality and act. Therefore, knowledge is not in God. Objection 2. Further, since science is about conclusions, it is a kind of knowledge caused by something else, which is the knowledge of principles, but nothing is caused in God. Therefore, science is not in God. Objection 3. Further, all knowledge is universal or particular, but in God there is no universal or particular. Question 3, Article 5. Therefore, in God there is not knowledge. On the contrary, the apostle says, O deaf of the riches of the wisdom and of the knowledge of God. Romans 11:33. I answer that, in God there exists the most perfect knowledge. To prove this, we must note that intelligent beings are distinguished from non-intelligent beings, in that the latter possesses only their own form, whereas the intelligent being is naturally adapted to have also the form of some other thing, for the idea of the thing known is in the knower. Hence it is manifest that the nature of a non-intelligent being is more contracted and limited, whereas the nature of intelligent beings has a greater amplitude and extension. Therefore the philosopher says, De Anima, Book 3, that the soul is in a sense all things. Now, the contraction of the form comes from the matter. Hence, as we have said above, Question 7, Article 1, forms according as they are the more immaterial approach more nearly to a kind of infinity. Therefore, it is clear that the immateriality of a thing is the reason why it is cognitive, and according to the mode of immateriality is the mode of knowledge. Hence it is said in De Anima, Book 2, that plants do not know, because they are wholly material, but sense is cognitive because it can receive images free from matter, and the intellect is still further cognitive, because it is more separated from matter and unmixed, as said in De Anima, Book 3. Since therefore God is in the highest degree of immateriality, as stated above, Question 7, Article 1, it follows that he occupies the highest place in knowledge. Reply to Objection 1. Because perfections flowing from God to creatures exist in a higher state in God himself, Question 4, Article 2. Whenever a name taken from any created perfection is attributed to God, it must be separated in its signification from anything that belongs to that imperfect mode proper to creatures. Hence, knowledge is not a quality of God, nor a habit, but substance and pure act. Reply to Objection 2. Whatever is divided and multiplied in creatures exists in God simply and unitedly. Question 13, Article 4. Now man has different kinds of knowledge, according to the different objects of his knowledge. He has intelligence as regards the knowledge of principles. He has science as regards knowledge of conclusions. He has wisdom, according as he knows the highest cause. He has counsel or prudence, according as he knows what is to be done. But God knows all these by one simple act of knowledge, as will be shown, Article 7. Hence, the simple knowledge of God can be named by all these names, in such a way, however, that there must be removed from each of them, so far as they enter into divine predication. Everything that savors of imperfection and everything that expresses perfection is to be retained in them. Hence it is said, with him is wisdom and strength. He hath counsel and understanding. Job 12:13. Reply to Objection 3. Knowledge is according to the mode of the one who knows, for the thing known is in the knower according to the mode of the knower. Now, since the mode of the divine essence is higher than that of creatures, divine knowledge does not exist in God after the mode of created knowledge, so as to be universal or particular or habitual or potential, or existing according to any such mode. Article 2. Whether God understands himself. Objection 1. It seems that God does not understand himself, for it is said by the philosopher Descartes, every knower who knows his own essence returns completely to his own essence. But God does not go out from his own essence, nor is he moved at all. Thus he cannot return to his own essence, and therefore he does not know his own essence. Objection 2. Further, to understand is a kind of passion and movement, as the philosopher says, De Anima, Book 3, and knowledge also is a kind of assimilation to the object known, and the thing known is the perfection of the knower. But nothing is moved or suffers or is made perfect by itself, nor, as Hilary says, De Trine, Book 3, is a thing its own likeness, and therefore God does not understand himself. Objection 3. Further, we are like to God chiefly in our intellect, because we are the image of God in our mind. As Augustine says, Gen. Ad Lit., Book 6, but our intellect understands itself only as it understands other things, as is said in De Anima, Book 3, and therefore God understands himself only so far perchance as he understands other things. On the contrary, it is written, the things that are of God no man knoweth but the Spirit of God. 1 Corinthians 2:11. I answer that God understands himself through himself. In proof whereof it must be known that although in operations which pass to an external effect, the object of the operation, which is taken as the term, exists outside the operator, nevertheless in operations that remain in the operator, the object signified as the term of operation resides in the operator, and accordingly as it is in the operator, the operation is actual. Hence, the philosopher says, De Anima, Book 3, that the sensible in act is sense in act, and the intelligible in act is intellect in act. For the reason why we actually feel or know a thing is because our intellect or sense is actually informed by the sensible or intelligible species. And because of this only, it follows that sense or intellect is distinct from the sensible or intelligible object, since both are in potentiality. Since, therefore, God has nothing in him of potentiality, but his pure act, his intellect and its object are altogether the same, so that he neither is without the intelligible species, as is the case with our intellect when it understands potentially, nor does the intelligible species differ from the substance of the divine intellect, as it differs in our intellect when it understands actually. But the intelligible species itself is the divine intellect itself, and thus God understands himself through himself. Reply to Objection 1. Return to its own essence means only that a thing subsists in itself, inasmuch as the form perfects the matter by giving it existence. It is in a certain way diffused in it, and it returns to itself inasmuch as it has existence in itself. Therefore those cognitive faculties which are not subsisting, but are the acts of organs, do not know themselves, as in the case of each of the senses, whereas those cognitive faculties which are subsisting know themselves. Hence it is said in De Causis that whoever knows his essence returns to it. Now it supremely belongs to God to be self-subsisting. Hence according to this mode of speaking, he supremely returns to his own essence and knows himself. Reply to Objection 2. Movement and passion are taken equivocally, according as to understand is described as a kind of movement or passion, as stated in De Anima, Book 3. For to understand is not a movement that is an act of something imperfect passing from one to another, but it is an act existing in the agent itself, of something perfect. Likewise, that the intellect is perfected by the intelligible object, that is assimilated to it, this belongs to an intellect which is sometimes in potentiality, because the fact of its being in a state of potentiality makes it differ from the intelligible object, and assimilates it thereto through the intelligible species, which is the likeness of the thing understood, and makes it to be perfected thereby, as potentiality is perfected by act. On the other hand, the divine intellect, which is no way in potentiality, is not perfected by the intelligible object, nor is it assimilated thereto, but is its own perfection, and its own intelligible object. Reply to Objection 3. Existence in nature does not belong to primary matter, which is a potentiality, unless it is reduced to act by a form. Now, our passive intellect has the same relation to intelligible objects as primary matter has to natural things, for it is in potentiality as regards intelligible objects, just as primary matter is to natural things. Hence our passive intellect can be exercised concerning intelligible objects only so far as it is perfected by the intelligible species of something, and in that way it understands itself by an intelligible species, as it understands other things. For it is manifest that by knowing the intelligible object, it understands also its own act of understanding, and by this act knows the intellectual faculty. But God is a pure act in the order of existence, as also in the order of intelligible objects. Therefore, he understands himself through himself. Article 3. Whether God comprehends himself. Objection 1. It seems that God does not comprehend himself. For Augustine says, Octog, 3, qua est, book 15, that whatever comprehends itself is finite as regards itself. But God is in all ways infinite, and therefore he does not comprehend himself. Objection 2. If it is said that God is infinite to us, and finite to himself, it can be urged to the contrary, that everything in God is truer than it is in us. If therefore God is finite to himself, but infinite to us, then God is more truly finite than infinite, which is against what was laid down above, question 7, article 1. Therefore God does not comprehend himself. On the contrary, Augustine says, Octog, 3, qua est, book 15, that everything that understands itself comprehends itself. But God understands himself, and therefore he comprehends himself. I answer that God perfectly comprehends himself, as can be thus proved. A thing is said to be comprehended when the end of the knowledge of it is attained. Sorry about that. And this is accomplished when it is known as perfectly as it is knowable. As, for instance, a demonstrable proposition is comprehended when known by demonstration, not, however, when it is known by some probable reason. Now, it is manifest that God knows himself as perfectly as he is perfectly knowable, for everything is knowable according to the mode of its own actuality, since a thing is not known according as it is in potentiality, but insofar as it is in actuality, as said in Metaphysics 9. Now, the power of God in knowing is as great as his actuality in existing, because it is from the fact that he is in act and free from all matter and potentiality that God is cognitive, as shown above, articles 1, 2. Whence it is manifest that he knows himself as much as he is knowable, and for that reason he perfectly comprehends himself. Reply to Objection 1. The strict meaning of comprehension signifies that one thing holds and includes another, and in this sense everything comprehended is finite, as also is everything included in another. But God is not said to be comprehended by himself in this sense, as if his intellect were a faculty apart from himself, and as if it held and included himself. For these modes of speaking are to be taken by way of negation. But as God is said to be in himself, forasmuch as he is not contained by anything outside of himself, so he is said to be comprehended by himself, forasmuch as nothing in himself is hidden from himself. For Augustine says, De vir duum ep cxii, the whole is comprehended when seen, if it is seen in such a way that nothing of it is hidden from the seer. Reply to Objection 2. When it is said, God is finite to himself, this is to be understood according to a certain similitude of proportion, because he has the same relation in not exceeding his intellect, as anything finite has in not exceeding finite intellect. But God is not to be called finite to himself in this sense, as if he understood himself to be something finite. Article 4. Whether the act of God's intellect is his substance. Objection 1. It seems that the act of God's intellect is not his substance, for to understand is an operation, but an operation signifies something proceeding from the operator, and therefore the act of God's intellect is not his substance. Objection 2. Further, to understand one's act of understanding is to understand something that is neither great nor chiefly understood, and but secondary and accessory. If therefore God be his own act of understanding, his act of understanding will be as when we understand our act of understanding, and thus God's act of understanding will not be something great. Objection 3. Further, every act of understanding means understanding something. When therefore God understands himself, if he himself is not distinct from this act of understanding, he understands that he understands himself, and so on to infinity, and therefore the act of God's intellect is not his substance. On the contrary, Augustine says De Trinitate, Book 7, in God, to be is the same as to be wise, but to be wise is the same thing as to understand, and therefore in God to be is the same thing as to understand. But God's existence is his substance, as shown above, question 3, article 4, and therefore the act of God's intellect is his substance. I answer that it must be said that the act of God's intellect is his substance. For if his act of understanding were other than his substance, then something else, as the philosopher says, Metaphysics, Book 12, would be the act and perfection of the divine substance, to which the divine substance would be related as potentiality to act, which is altogether impossible, because the intellect of understanding is the perfection and act of the one understanding. Let us now consider how this is, as was laid down above, Article 2. To understand is not an act passing to anything extrinsic, for it remains in the operator as his own act and perfection, as existence is the perfection of the one existing. Just as existence follows on the form, so in like manner to understand follows on the intelligible species. Now in God there is no form which is something other than his existence, as shown above, question 3. Hence, as his essence itself is also his intelligible species, it necessarily follows that his act of understanding must be his essence and his existence. Thus it follows from all the foregoing that in God, intellect and the object understood and the intelligible species and his act of understanding are entirely one and the same. Hence, when God is said to be understanding, no kind of multiplicity is attached to his substance. Reply to Objection 1. To understand is not an operation proceeding out of the operator, but remaining in him. Reply to Objection 2. When that act of understanding which is not subsistent is understood, something not great is understood, as when we understand our act of understanding, and so this cannot be likened to the act of the divine understanding, which is subsistent. Thus appears the reply to the third objection. For the act of divine understanding subsists in itself and belongs to its very self, and is not in others. Hence it need not proceed to infinity. Article 5. Whether God knows things other than himself. Objection 1. It seems that God does not know things besides himself, for all other things but God are outside of God, But Augustine says, octog tri qua est qu xlvi, that God does not behold anything out of himself, and therefore he does not know things other than himself. Objection 2. Further, the object understood is the perfection of the one who understands. If therefore God understands other things besides himself, something else will be the perfection of God, and will be nobler than he, which is impossible. Objection 3. Further, the act of understanding is specified by the intelligible object, as is every other act from its own object. Hence the intellectual act is so much the nobler the object understood. But God is his own intellectual act. If therefore God understands anything other than himself, then God himself is specified by something else than himself, which cannot be, therefore he does not understand things other than himself. On the contrary, it is written, all things are naked and open to his eyes. Hebrews 4:13. I answer that God necessarily knows things other than himself, for it is manifest that he perfectly understands himself. Otherwise, his existence would not be perfect, since his existence is his act of understanding. Now, if anything is perfectly known, it follows of necessity that its power is perfectly known. But the power of anything can be perfectly known only by knowing to what its power extends. Since therefore the divine power extends to other things by the very fact that it is the first effective cause of all things, as is clear from the aforesaid question 2, article 3. God must necessarily know things other than himself, and this appears still more plainly if we add that the every existence of the first effective cause, viz., God, is his own act of understanding. Hence, whatever effects pre-exists in God, as in the first cause, must be in his act of understanding, and all things must be in him according to an intelligible mode, for everything which is in another is in it according to the mode of that in which it is. Now, in order to know how God knows things other than himself, we must consider that a thing is known in two ways, in itself and in another. A thing is known in itself when it is known by the proper species adequate to the knowable object, as when the eye sees a man through the image of a man. A thing is seen in another through the image of that which contains it, as when a part is seen in the whole by the image of the whole, or when a man is seen in a mirror by the image in the mirror, or by any other mode by which one thing is seen in another. So we say that God sees himself in himself, because he sees himself through his essence, and he sees other things not in themselves but in himself, inasmuch as his essence contains the similitude of things other than himself. Reply to objection 1. The passage of Augustine in which it is said that God sees nothing outside himself is not to be taken in such a way, as if God saw nothing outside himself, but in the sense that what is outside himself, he does not see except in himself, as above explained. Reply to objection 2. The object understood is a perfection of the one understanding not by its substance but by its image, according to which it is in the intellect, as its form and perfection, as is said in De Anima, Book 3. For a stone is not in the soul but its image. Now those things which are other than God are understood by God, inasmuch as the essence of God contains their images, as above explained. Hence it does not follow that there is any perfection in the divine intellect other than the divine essence. Reply to objection 3. The intellectual act is not specified by what is understood in another, but by the principal object understood in which other things are understood. For the intellectual act is specified by its object, inasmuch as the intelligible form is the principle of the intellectual operation. Since every operation is specified by the form which is its principle of operation, as heating by heat, hence the intellectual operation is specified by that intelligible form which makes the intellect an act. And this is the image of the principal thing understood, which in God is nothing but his own essence, in which all images of things are comprehended. Hence it does not follow that the divine intellectual act, or rather God himself, is specified by anything else than the divine essence itself. Article 6. Whether God knows things other than himself by proper knowledge. Objection 1. It seems that God does not know things other than himself by proper knowledge. For as was shown Article 5, God knows things other than himself according as they are in himself. But Other things are in him as in their common and universal cause, and are known by God as in their first and universal cause. This is to know them by general, and not by proper knowledge, and therefore God knows things besides himself by general, and not by proper knowledge. Objection 2. Further, the created essence is as distant from the divine essence, as the divine essence is distant from the created essence. But the divine essence cannot be known by the created essence, as said above, question 12, article 2, and therefore neither can the created essence be known by the divine essence. Thus, as God knows only by his essence, it follows that he does not know what the creature is in its essence, so as to know what it is, which is to have proper knowledge of it. Objection 3. Further, proper knowledge of a thing can come only through its proper ratio, but as God knows all things by his essence, it seems that he does not know each thing by its proper ratio, for one thing cannot be the proper ratio of many and diverse things, and therefore God has not a proper knowledge of things but a general knowledge, for to know things otherwise than by their proper ratio is to have only a common and general knowledge of them. On the contrary, to have a proper knowledge of things is to know them not only in general, but as they are distinct from each other. Now God knows things in that manner. Hence it is written that he reaches even to the division of the soul and the spirit, of the joints also in the marrow, and is a discerner of thoughts and intents of the heart. Neither is there any creature invisible in his sight. Hebrews 4:12-13. I answer that some have erred on this point, saying that God knows things other than himself only in general, that is, only as beings. For as fire, if it knew the nature of heat, and all things else insofar as they are hot, so God, through knowing himself as the principle of being, knows the nature of being, and all other things insofar as they are beings. But this cannot be, for to know a thing in general, and not in particular, is to have an imperfect knowledge. Hence our intellect, when it is reduced from potentiality to act, acquires first a universal and confused knowledge of things, before it knows them in particular, as proceeding from the imperfect to the perfect, as is clear from Physics 1. If therefore the knowledge of God regarding things other than himself is only universal and not special, it would follow that his understanding would not be absolutely perfect. Therefore, neither would his being be perfect, and this is against what was said above, question 4, article 1. We must therefore hold that God knows things other than himself with a proper knowledge, not only insofar as being is common to them, but insofar as one is distinguished from the other. In proof thereof, we may observe that some, wishing to show that God knows many things by one, bring forward some examples, as, for instance, that if the center knew itself, it would know all lines that proceed from the center, or if light knew itself, it would know all colors. Now these examples, although they are similar in part, namely as regards universal causality, nevertheless they fail in this respect, that multitude and diversity are caused by the one universal principle, not as regards that which is the principle of distinction, but only as regards that in which they communicate. For the diversity of colors is not caused by the light only, but by the different disposition of the diaphanous medium which receives it. And likewise, the diversity of the lines is caused by their different position. Hence it is that this kind of diversity and multitude cannot be known in its principle by proper knowledge, but only in a general way. In God, however, it is otherwise. For it was shown above, question 4, article 2, that whatever perfection exists in any creature, wholly pre-exists and is contained in God in an excelling manner. Now, not only what is common to creatures, viz., being, belongs to their perfection, but also what makes them distinguished from each other, as living and understanding and the like, whereby living beings are distinguished from the non-living, and the intelligent from the non-intelligent. Likewise, every form whereby each thing is constituted in its own species is a perfection, and thus all things pre-exist in God, not only as regards what is common to all, but also as regards what distinguishes one thing from another. And therefore, as God contains all perfections in himself, the essence of God is compared to all other essences of things, not as the common to the proper, as unity is to numbers, or as the center of a circle to the radiating lines, but as perfect acts to imperfect, as if I were as if I were to compare man to animal, or 6, a perfect number, to the imperfect numbers contained under it. Now it is manifest that by a perfect act, imperfect acts can be known not only in general, but also by proper knowledge. Thus, for example, whoever knows a man knows an animal by proper knowledge, and whoever knows the number 6 knows the number 3 also by proper knowledge. As therefore, the essence of God contains in itself all the perfection contained in the essence of any other being, and far more, God can know in himself all of them with proper knowledge. For the nature proper to each thing consists in some degree of participation in the divine perfection. Now God cannot be said to know himself perfectly unless he knew all the ways in which his own perfection can be shared by others. Neither could he know the very nature of being perfectly, unless he knew all modes of being. Hence, it is manifest that God knows all things with proper knowledge in their distinction from each other. Reply to objection 1. So to know a thing as it is in the knower may be understood in two ways. In one way, this adverb, so, imports the mode of knowledge on the part of the thing known, and in that sense it is false, for the knower does not always know the object known according to the existence it has in the knower, since the eye does not know a stone according to the existence it has in the eye, but by the image of the stone which is in the eye, and the eye knows the stone according to its existence outside the eye. And if any knower has a knowledge of the object known according to the mode of existence it has in the knower nevertheless knows it according to its mode of existence outside the knower. Thus the intellect knows a stone according to the intelligible existence it has in the intellect, inasmuch as it knows that it understands, while nevertheless it knows what a stone is in its own nature. If, however, the adverb so be understood to import the mode of knowledge on the part of the knower, in that sense it is true that only the knower has knowledge of the object known as it is in the knower, for the more perfectly the thing known is in the knower, the more perfect is the mode of knowledge. We must say, therefore, that God not only knows that all things are in himself, but by the fact that they are in him, he knows them in their own nature, and all the more perfectly each one is in him. Reply to objection 2. The created essence is compared to the essence of God as the imperfect to the perfect act, and therefore the created essence cannot sufficiently lead us to the knowledge of the divine essence, but rather the converse. Reply to objection 3. The same thing cannot be taken in an equal manner as the ratio of different things, but the divine essence excels all creatures. Hence it can be taken as the proper ration of each thing according to the diverse ways in which diverse creatures participate in and imitate it. Article 7. Whether the knowledge of God is discursive. Objection 1. It seems that the knowledge of God is discursive, for the knowledge of God is not habitual knowledge, but actual knowledge. Now the philosopher says, topic 2, the habit of knowledge may regard many things at once, but actual understanding regards only one thing at a time. Therefore, as God knows many things, himself and others, as shown above, Articles 2:5, it seems that he does not understand all at once, but discourses from one another. Objection 2. Further, discursive knowledge is to know the effect through its cause. But God knows things through himself as an effect is known through its cause, and therefore his knowledge is discursive. Objection 3. Further, God knows each creature more perfectly than we know it, but we know the effects in their created causes, and thus we go discursively from causes to things caused. Therefore it seems that the same applies to God. On the contrary, Augustine says, De Trinitate, Book 15, God does not see all things in their particularity or separately, as if he saw alternately here and there, but he sees all things together at once. I answer that, in the divine knowledge there is no discursion, the proof of which is as follows. In our knowledge there is a twofold discursion. One is according to succession only, as when we have actually understood anything, we turn ourselves to understand something else, while the other mode of discursion is according to causality, as when through principles we arrive at the knowledge of conclusions. The first kind of discursion cannot belong to God. For many things which we understand in succession, if each is considered in itself, we understand simultaneously if we see them in some one thing. If, for instance, we understand the parts in the whole, or see different things see different things in a mirror. Now God sees all things in one thing, which is himself, and therefore God sees all things together, and not successively. Likewise, the second mode of discursion cannot be applied to God. First, because the second mode of discursion presupposes the first mode. For whosoever proceeds from principles to conclusions does not consider both at once. Secondly, because to discourse thus is to proceed from the known to the unknown. Hence it is manifest that when the first is known, the second is still unknown, and thus the second is known not in the first, but from the first. Now the term discursive reasoning is attained when the second is seen in the first, by resolving the effects into their causes, and then the discursion ceases. Hence, as God sees his effects in himself as their cause, his knowledge is not discursive. Reply to objection 1. Altogether, there is only one act of understanding in itself. Nevertheless, many things may be understood in one medium, as shown above. Reply to objection 2. God does not know by their cause known, as it were previously, effects unknown, but he knows the effects in the cause, and hence his knowledge is not discursive, as was shown above. Reply to objection 3. God sees the effects of created causes in the causes themselves, much better than we can, but still not in such a manner that the knowledge of the effects is caused in him by the knowledge of the created causes, as is the cause with us, and hence his knowledge is not discursive. Article 8. Whether the knowledge of God is the cause of things. Objection 1. It seems that the knowledge of God is not the cause of things. For Origen says, on Romans 8:30, whom he called them, he also justified, etc. A thing will happen not because God knows it as future, but because it is future. It is on that account known by God before it exists. Objection 2. Further, given the cause, the effect follows, but the knowledge of God is eternal. Therefore, if the knowledge of God is the cause of things created, it seems that creatures are eternal. Objection 3. Further, the thing known is prior to knowledge, and is its measure, as the philosopher says, Metaphysics 10. But what is posterior and measured cannot be a cause. Therefore, the knowledge of God is not the cause of things. On the contrary, Augustine says, De Trinitate, Book 15, not because they are, does God know all creatures spiritual and temporal, but because he knows them, therefore they are. I answer that the knowledge of God is the cause of things, for the knowledge of God is to all creatures what the knowledge of the artificer is to things made by his art. Now the knowledge of the artificer is the cause of the things made by his art from the fact that the artificer works by his intellect. Hence the form of the intellect must be the principle of action, as heat is the principle of heating. Nevertheless, we must observe that a natural form, being a form that remains in that to which it gives existence, denotes a principle of action, according only as it has an inclination to an effect. And likewise, the intelligible form does not denote a principle of action insofar as it resides in the one who understands, unless there is added to it the inclination to an effect, which inclination is through the will. For since the intelligible form has a relation to opposite things, inasmuch as the same knowledge relates to opposites, it would not produce a determinate effect, unless it were determined to one thing by the appetite, as the philosopher says, Metaphysics 9. Now, it is manifest that God causes things by his intellect, since his being is his act of understanding, and hence his knowledge must be the cause of things, insofar as his will is joined to it. Hence the knowledge of God as the cause of things is usually called the knowledge of approbation. Reply to objection 1. Origen spoke in reference to that aspect of knowledge to which the idea of causality does not belong unless the will is joined to it, as is said above. But when he says the reason why God foreknows some things is because they are future, this must be understood according to the cause of consequence, and not according to the cause of essence. For if things are in the future, it follows that God knows them, but not that the futurity of things is the cause why God knows them. Reply to objection 2. The knowledge of God is the cause of things, according as things are in his knowledge, Now, that things should be eternal was not in the knowledge of God. Hence, although the knowledge of God is eternal, it does not follow that creatures are eternal. Reply to objection 3. Natural things are midway between the knowledge of God and our knowledge. For we receive knowledge from natural things, of which God is the cause by his knowledge. Hence, as the natural objects of knowledge are prior to our knowledge, and are its measure, so the knowledge of God is prior to natural things, and is the measure of them. As, for instance, a house is midway between the knowledge of the builder who made it, and the knowledge of the one who gathers his knowledge of the house from the house already built. Article 9. Whether God has knowledge of things that are not. Objection 1. It seems that God has not knowledge of things that are not, for the knowledge of God is of true things, but truth and being are convertible terms. Therefore the knowledge of God is not of things that are not. Objection 2. Further, knowledge requires likeness between the knower and the thing known, but those things that are not cannot have any likeness to God, who is very being, and therefore what is not cannot be known by God. Objection 3. Further, the knowledge of God is the cause of what is known by him, but it is not the cause of things that are not, because a thing that is not has no cause. Therefore God has no knowledge of things that are not. On the contrary, the Apostle says, Who calleth those things that are not as those that are? Romans 4:17. I answer that God knows all things whatsoever that in any way are. Now it is possible that things that are not absolutely should be in a certain sense, for things absolutely are which are actual, whereas things which are not actual are in the power either of God himself or of a creature, whether in active power or passive, whether in power of thought or of imagination or of any other manner of meaning whatsoever. Whatever therefore can be made, or thought, or said by the creature, as also whatever he himself can do, are all known to God, although they are not actual, and in so far it can be said that he has knowledge even of things that are not. Now a certain difference is to be noted in the consideration of those things that are not actual. For though some of them may not be in act now, still they were, or they will be, and God is said to know all these with the knowledge of vision. For since God's act of understanding, which is his being, is measured by eternity, and since eternity is without succession, comprehending all time, the present glance of God extends over all time, and to all things which exist in any time as to objects present to him. But there are other things in God's power or the creatures, which nevertheless are not, nor will be, nor were, and as regards these, he is said to have knowledge, not of vision, but of simple intelligence. This is so called because the things we see around us have distinct being outside the seer. Reply to objection 1. Those things that are not actual are true insofar as they are in potentiality, for it is true that they are in potentiality, and as such they are known by God. Reply to objection 2. Since God is very being, everything is, insofar as it participates in the likeness of God. As everything is hot insofar as it participates in heat, so things in potentiality are known by God, although they are not in act. Reply to objection 3. The knowledge of God joined to his will is the cause of things. Hence it is not necessary that whatever God knows is or was or will be, but only is this necessary as regards what he wills to be or permits to be. Further, it is in the knowledge of God not that they be, but that they be possible. Article 10. Whether God knows evil things. It seems that God does not know evil things. For the philosopher... Oh, sorry, I forgot to mention the objection. Objection 1. It seems that God does not know evil things. For the philosopher, De Anima, Book 3, says that the intellect which is not in potentiality does not know privation, but evil is the privation of good, as Augustine says, Confessions 3, Book 3, 7. Therefore, as the intellect of God is never in potentiality, but is always in act, as is clear from the foregoing Article 2, it seems that God does not know evil things. Objection 2. Further, all knowledge is either the cause of the thing known, or is caused by it. But the knowledge of God is not the cause of evil, nor is it caused by evil. Therefore God does not know evil things. Objection 3. Further, everything known is known either by its likeness or by its opposite, but whatever God knows, he knows through his essence, as is clear from the foregoing, Article 5. Now the divine essence neither is the likeness of evil, nor is evil contrary to it. For to the divine essence there is no contrary, as Augustine says, De Civ. Dei, Book 12. Therefore God does not know evil things. Objection 4. Further, what is known through another and not through itself is imperfectly known. But evil is not known by God. For the thing known must be in the knower. Therefore, if evil is known through another, namely through good, it would be known by him imperfectly, which cannot be, for the knowledge of God is not imperfect. Therefore, God does not know evil things. On the contrary, it is written, Proverbs 15:11, Hell and destruction are before God. I answer that, whoever knows a thing perfectly must know all that can be accidental to it. Now there are some good things to which corruption by evil may be accidental. Hence, God would not know good things perfectly, unless he also knew evil things. Now a thing is knowable in the degree in which it is. Hence, since this is the essence of evil, that is, the privation of good, by the fact that God knows good things, he knows evil things also, as by light is known darkness. Hence Dionysius says, Divine Names, Book 7, God through himself receives the vision of darkness, not otherwise, seeing darkness except through light. Reply to Objection 1. The saying of the philosopher must be understood as meaning that the intellect which is not in potentiality does not know privation by privation existing in it, and this agrees with what he said previously, that a point and every indivisible thing are known by privation of division. This is because simple and indivisible forms are in our intellect, not actually, but only potentially. For were they actually in our intellect, they would not be known by privation. It is thus that simple things are known by separate substances. God therefore knows evil, not by privation existing in himself, but by the opposite good. Reply to Objection 2. The knowledge of God is not the cause of evil, but is the cause of the good whereby evil is known. Reply to Objection 3. Although evil is not opposed to the divine essence, which is not corruptible by evil, it is opposed to the effects of God, which he knows by his essence, and knowing them, he knows the opposite evils. Reply to Objection 4. To know a thing by something else only belongs to imperfect knowledge, if that thing is of itself knowable, but evil is not of itself knowable, forasmuch as the very nature of evil means the privation of good. Therefore evil can neither be defined nor known except by good. Article 11. Whether God knows singular things. Objection 1. It seems that God does not know singular things, for the divine intellect is more immaterial than the human intellect. Now the human intellect, by reason of its immateriality, does not know singular things, but as the philosopher says, De Anima 2, reason has to do with universals, sense with singular things. Therefore God does not know singular things. Objection 2. Further, in us, those faculties alone know the singular which receive the species not abstracted from material conditions. But in God, things are in the highest degree abstracted from all materiality. Therefore God does not know singular things. Objection 3. Further, all knowledge comes about through the medium of some likeness, but the likeness of singular things, insofar as they are singular, does not seem to be in God, for the principle of singularity is matter, which, since it is in potentiality only, is altogether unlike God, who is pure act. Therefore God cannot know singular things. On the contrary, it is written, Proverbs 16:2, All the ways of a man are open to his eyes. I answer that God knows singular things, for all perfections found in creatures pre-exist in God in a higher way, as is clear from the foregoing, question 4, article 2. Now to know singular things is part of our perfection, hence God must know singular things. Even the philosopher considers it incongruous that anything known by us should be unknown to God, and thus against Empedocles he argues, De Anima Book 1 and Metaphysics Book 3, that God would be most ignorant if he did not know discord. Now, The perfections which are divided among inferior beings exist simply and unitedly in God. Hence, although by one faculty we know the universal and immaterial, and by another we know singular and material things, nevertheless God knows both by his simple intellect. Now some, wishing to show how this can be, said that God knows singular things by universal causes. For nothing exists in any singular thing that does not arise from some universal cause. They give the example of an astrologer who knows all the universal movements of the heavens, and can thence foretell all eclipses that are to come. This, however, is not enough, for singular things from universal causes attain to certain forms and powers, which, however they may be joined together, are not individualized except by individual matter. Hence he who knows Socrates because he is white, or because he is the son of Sophroniscus, or because of something of that kind, would not know him, insofar as he is this particular man. Hence, according to the aforesaid mode, God would not know singular things in their singularity. On the other hand, others have said that God knows singular things by the application of universal causes to particular effects, but this will not hold, for as much as no one can apply a thing to another, unless he first knows that thing. Hence the said application cannot be the reason of knowing the particular, for it presupposes the knowledge of singular things. Therefore it must be said otherwise, that since God is the cause of things by his knowledge, as stated above Article 8, his knowledge extends as far as his causality extends. Hence, as the active power of God extends not only to forms, which are the source of universality, but also to matter, as we shall prove further on, question 44, Article 2. The knowledge of God must extend to singular things, which are individualized by matter. For since he knows things other than himself by his essence, as being the likeness of things, or as their active principle, his essence must be the sufficing principle of knowing all things made by him, not only in the universal, but also in the singular. The same would apply to the knowledge of the artificer, if it were productive of the whole thing, and not only of the form. Reply to Objection 1. Our intellect abstracts the intelligible species from the individualizing principles. Hence, the intelligible species in our intellect cannot be the likeness of the individual principles. And on that account, our intellect does not know the singular, but the intelligible species in the divine intellect, which is the essence of God, is immaterial not by abstraction but of itself, being the principle of all the principles which enter into the composition of things, whether principles of the species or principles of the individual. Hence by it God knows not only universal but also singular things. Reply to Objection 2. Although as regards the species in the divine intellect, its being has no material conditions like the images received in the imagination and sense, yet its power extends to both immaterial and material things. Reply to Objection 3. Although matter as regards its potentiality recedes from likeness to God, yet even insofar as it has being in this wise, it retains a certain likeness to the divine being. Article 12. Whether God can know infinite things. Objection 1. It seems that God cannot know infinite things, for the infinite, as such, is unknown, since the infinite is that which, to those who measure it, leaves away something more to be measured, as the philosopher says, Physics 3. Moreover, Augustine says, De Civ. Dei, Book 12, that whatever is comprehended by knowledge is bounded by the comprehension of the knower. Now infinite things have no boundary, therefore they cannot be comprehended by the knowledge of God. Objection 2. Further, if we say that things infinite in themselves are finite in God's knowledge, against this it may be urged that the essence of the infinite is that it is untraversable, and the finite that is traversable, as said in Physics Book 3. But the infinite is not traversable either by the finite or by the infinite, as is proved in Physics 6. Therefore, the infinite cannot be bounded by the finite, nor even by the infinite, and so the infinite cannot be finite in God's knowledge, which is infinite. Objection 3. Further, the knowledge of God is the measure of what is known, but it is contrary to the essence of the infinite that it be measured. Therefore, infinite things cannot be known by God. On the contrary, Augustine says, De Civ. Dei, Book 12, although we cannot number the infinite, nevertheless it can be comprehended by him whose knowledge has no bounds. I answer that, Since God knows not only things actual, but also things possible to himself or to created things, as shown above, Article 9, and as these must be infinite, it must be held that he knows infinite things. Although the knowledge of vision, which has relation only to things that are, or will be, or were, is not of infinite things, as some say, for we do not say that the world is eternal, nor that generation and movement will go on forever, so that individuals be infinitely multiplied. Yet, if we consider more attentively, we must hold that God knows infinite things even by the knowledge of vision. For God knows even the thoughts and affections of hearts, which will be multiplied to infinity as rational creatures go on forever. The reason of this is to be found in the fact that the knowledge of every knower is measured by the mode of the form, which is the principle of knowledge. For the sensible image in sense is the likeness of only one individual thing, and can give the knowledge of only one individual. But the intelligible species of our intellect is the likeness of the thing as regards its specific nature, which is participle by infinite particulars. Hence, our intellect, by the intelligible species of man in a certain way, knows infinite men, not, however, as distinguished from each other, but as communicating in the nature of the species. And the reason is because the intelligible species of our intellect is the likeness of man, not as to the individual principles, but as to the principles of the species. On the other hand, the divine essence, whereby the divine intellect understands, is a sufficing likeness of all things that are, or can be, not only as regards the universal principles, but also as regards the principles proper to each one, as shown above. Hence it follows that the knowledge of God extends to infinite things, even as distinct from each other. Reply to Objection 1. The idea of the infinite pertains to quantity, as the philosopher says, Physics Book 1, but the idea of quantity implies the order of parts. Therefore, to know the infinite according to the mode of the infinite is to know part after part. And in this way, the infinite cannot be known. For whatever quantity of parts be taken, there will always remain something else outside. But God does not know the infinite or infinite things as if he enumerated part after part, since he knows all things simultaneously, and not successively, as said above, Article 7. Hence there is nothing to prevent him from knowing infinite things. Reply to Objection 2. Transition imports a certain succession of parts, and hence it is that the infinite cannot be traversed by the finite nor by the infinite. But equality suffices for comprehension, because that is said to be comprehended which has nothing outside the comprehender. Hence it is not against the idea of the infinite to be comprehended by the infinite. And so, what is infinite in itself can be called finite to the knowledge of God as comprehended, but not as if it were traversable. Reply to Objection 3. The knowledge of God is the measure of things, not quantitatively, for the infinite is not subject to this kind of measure, but it is the measure of the essence and truth of things, for everything has truth of nature according to the degree in which it imitates the knowledge of God, as the thing made by art agrees with the art. Granted, however, an actually infinite number of things, for instance an infinitude of men, or an infinitude in continuous quantity, as an infinitude of air, as some of the ancients held, yet it is manifest that these would have a determinate and finite being, because their being would be limited to some determinate nature. Hence they would be measurable as regards the knowledge of God. Article 13. Whether the knowledge of God is of future contingent things. Objection 1. It seems that the knowledge of God is not of future contingent things, for from a necessary cause proceeds a necessary effect, but the knowledge of God is the cause of things known, as said above, Article 8. Since therefore that knowledge is necessary, what he knows must also be necessary. Therefore the knowledge of God is not of contingent things. Objection 2. Further, every conditional proposition of which the antecedent is absolutely necessary must have an absolutely necessary consequent, for the antecedent is to the consequent as principles are to the conclusion, and from the necessary principles only a necessary conclusion can follow, as is proved in Posterior Analytics, Book 1. But this is a true conditional proposition. If God knew that this thing will be, it will be, for the knowledge of God is not only of true things. Now, The antecedent conditional of this is absolutely necessary, because it is eternal, and because it is signified as past. Therefore, the consequence is also absolutely necessary. Therefore, whatever God knows is necessary, and so the knowledge of God is not of contingent things. Objection 3. Further, everything known by God must necessarily be, because even what we ourselves know must necessarily be. And, of course, the knowledge of God is much more certain than ours, but no future contingent things must necessarily be, therefore no contingent future thing is known by God. On the contrary, it is written, Psalms 32:15, He who hath made the hearts of every one of them, who understandeth all their works, that is, of men. Now the works of men are contingent, being subject to free will. Therefore God knows future contingent things. I answer that, since as was shown above Article 9, God knows all things, not only things actual, but also things possible to him, and creature. And since some of these are future contingent to us, it follows that God knows future contingent things. In evidence of this, we must consider that a contingent thing can be considered in two ways. First, in itself, insofar as it is now in act, and in this sense it is not considered as future but as present. Neither is it considered as contingent as having reference to one of two terms, but as determined to one, and on account of this it can be infallibly the object of certain knowledge. For instance, to the sense of sight, as when I see that Socrates is sitting down. In another way, a contingent thing can be understood as it is in its cause, and in this way it is considered as future, and as a contingent thing not yet determined to one. For as much as a contingent cause has relation to opposite things, and in this sense a contingent thing is not subject to any certain knowledge. Hence, whoever knows a contingent effect in its cause only, has merely a conjectural knowledge of it. Now God knows all contingent things not only as they are in their causes, but also as each one of them is actually in itself. And although contingent things become actual successively, nevertheless God knows contingent things not successively, as they are in their own being, as we do, but simultaneously. The reason is because his knowledge is measured by eternity, as is also his being, and eternity being simultaneously whole comprises all of time, as said above. Question 10, Article 2. Hence all things that are in time are present to God from eternity, not only because he has the types of things present within him, as some say, but because his glance is carried from eternity over all things as they are in their presentiality. Hence it is manifest that contingent things are infallibly known by God, inasmuch as they are subject to the divine sight in their presentiality. Yet they are future contingent things in relation to their own causes. Reply to Objection 1. Although the supreme cause is necessary, the effect may be contingent by reason of the proximate contingent cause, just as the germination of a plant is contingent by reason of the proximate contingent cause. Although the movement of the sun, which is the first cause, is necessary, so likewise things known by God are contingent on account of their proximate causes, while the knowledge of God, which is the first cause, is necessary. Reply to Objection 2. Some say that this antecedent, God knew this contingent to be future, is not necessary, but contingent, because although it is past, still it imports relation to the future. This, however, does not remove necessity from it, for whatever has had relation to the future must have had it, although the future sometimes does not follow. On the other hand, some say that this antecedent is contingent, because it is a compound of necessary and contingent, as this saying is contingent, Socrates is a white man. But this also is to no purpose, for when we say, God knew this contingent to be future, contingent is used here only as the matter of the word, and not as the chief part of the proposition. Hence, its contingency or necessity has no reference to the necessity or contingency of the proposition, or to its being true or false. For it may be just as true that I said a man is an ass, as that I said Socrates runs, or God is, and the same applies to necessary and contingent. Hence it must be said that this antecedent is absolutely necessary, nor does it follow, as some say, that the consequent is absolutely necessary, because the antecedent is the remote cause of the consequent, which is contingent by reason of the proximate cause. But this is to no purpose, for the conditional would be false were its antecedent the remote necessary cause, and the consequent a contingent effect. As for example, if I said, if the sun moves, the grass will grow. Therefore, we must reply otherwise, that when the antecedent contains anything belonging to an act of the soul, the consequent must be taken not as it is in itself, but as it is in the soul. For the existence of a thing in itself is different from the existence of a thing in the soul. For example, when I say, what the soul understands is immaterial, this is to be understood that it is immaterial as it is in the intellect, not as it is in itself. Likewise, if I say, if God knew anything it will be, the consequent must be understood as it is subject to the divine knowledge, that is, as it is in presentiality, and thus it is necessary as also is the antecedent, for everything that is, while it is, must be necessarily be, as the philosopher says in Peri Herm, Book 1. Reply to Objection 3. Things reduced to act in time as known by us successively in time, but by God are known in eternity, which is above time, whence to us they cannot be certain, forasmuch as we know future contingent things as such, but they are certain to God alone, whose understanding is in eternity above time. Just as he who goes along the road does not see those who come after him, whereas he who sees the whole road from a height sees at once all traveling by the way. Hence, what is known by us must be necessary, even as it is in itself. For what is future contingent in itself cannot be known by us, whereas what is known by God must be necessary according to the mode in which they are subject to the divine knowledge, as already stated, but not absolutely as considered in their own causes. Hence also this proposition, everything known by God must necessarily be, is usually distinguished, for this may refer to the thing or to the saying. If it refers to the thing, it is divided and false. For the sense is, everything which God knows is necessary. If understood of the saying, it is composite and true. For the sense is, this proposition, that which is known by God is necessary. Now, some urge an objection and say that this distinction holds good with regard to forms that are separable from the subject. Thus, if I said, it is possible for a white thing to be black, it is false as applied to the saying, and true as applied to the thing. For a thing which is white can become black, whereas this saying, a white thing is black, can never be true. But in forms that are inseparable from the subject, this distinction does not hold. For instance, if I said, a black crow can be white, for in both senses it is false. Now to be known by God is inseparable from the thing, for what is known by God cannot be known. This objection, however, would hold if these words, that which is known, implied any disposition inherent to the subject. But since they import an act of the knower, something can be attributed to the thing known in itself, even if it always be known, which is not attributed to it insofar as it stands under actual knowledge. Thus material existence is attributed to a stone in itself, which is not attributed to it inasmuch as it is known. Article 14. Whether God knows enunciable things. Objection 1. It seems that God does not know enunciable things, for to know enunciable things belongs to our intellect, as it composes and divides. But in the divine intellect there is no composition, therefore God does not know enunciable things. Objection 2. Further, every kind of knowledge is made through some likeness, but in God there is no likeness of enunciable things, since he is altogether simple. Therefore God does not know enunciable things. On the contrary, it is written, the Lord knoweth the thoughts of men. Psalms 93:11. But enunciable things are contained in the thoughts of men. Therefore God knows enunciable things. I answer that, since it is in the power of our intellect to form enunciations, and since God knows whatever is in his own power or in that of creatures, as said above, Article 9, it follows of necessity that God knows all enunciations that can be formed. Now, just as he knows material things immaterially, and composite things simply, so likewise he knows enunciable things not after the manner of enunciable things, as if in his intellect there were composition or division of enunciations. For he knows each thing by simple intelligence, by understanding the essence of each thing. As if we, by the very fact that we understand what man is, were to understand all that can be predicated of man. This, however, does not happen in our intellect, which discourses from one thing to another, forasmuch as the intelligible species represents one thing in such a way as not to represent another. Hence, when we understand what man is, we do not forthwith understand other things which belong to him, but we understand them one by one, according to a certain succession. On this account, the things we understand as separated, we must reduce to one by way of composition or division, by forming an enunciation. Now, the species of the divine intellect, which is God's essence, suffices to represent all things. Hence, by understanding his essence, God knows the essences of all things, and also whatever can be accidental to them. Reply to objection 1. This objection would avail if God knew enunciable things after the manner of enunciable things. Reply to objection 2. Enunciatory composition signifies some existence of a thing, and thus God by his existence, which is his essence, is the similitude of all those things which are signified by enunciation. Article 15. Whether the knowledge of God is variable. Objection 1. It seems that the knowledge of God is variable, for knowledge is related to what is knowable, but whatever imports relation to the creature is applied to God from time, and varies according to the variation of creatures. Therefore the knowledge of God is variable according to the variation of creatures. Objection 2. Further, whatever God can make, he can know. But God can make more than he does. Therefore he can know more than he knows. Thus his knowledge can vary according to increase and diminution. Objection 3. Further, God knew that Christ would be born, but he does not know now that Christ will be born, because Christ is not to be born in the future. Therefore God does not know everything he once knew, and thus the knowledge of God is variable. On the contrary, it is said, that in God there is no change nor shadow of alteration, James 1:17. I answer that, since the knowledge of God is his substance, as is clear from the foregoing Article 4, just as his substance is altogether immutable, as shown above, question 9, Article 1, so his knowledge likewise must be altogether invariable. Reply to objection 1. Lord, Creator, and the like import relations to creatures insofar as they are in themselves, but the knowledge of God imports relation to creatures insofar as they are in God, because everything is actually understood according as it is in the one who understands. Now created things are in God in an invariable manner, while they exist variably in themselves. We may also say that Lord, Creator, and the like import the relations consequent upon the acts, which are understood as terminating in the creatures themselves, as they are in themselves, and thus these relations are attributed to God variously, according to the variation of creatures. But knowledge, and love, and the like import relations consequent upon the acts which are understood to be in God, and therefore those are predicated of God in an invariable manner. Or these are predicated of God in an invariable manner. Reply to objection 2. God knows also what he can make, and does not make. Hence, from the fact that he can make more than he makes, it does not follow that he can know more than he knows, unless this be referred to the knowledge of vision, according to which he is said to know those things which are in act in some period of time. But from the fact that he knows some things might be which are not, or that some things might not be which are, it does not follow that his knowledge is variable, but rather that he knows the variability of things. If, however, anything existed which God did not previously know, and afterwards knew, then his knowledge would be variable. But this could not be, for whatever is or can be in any period of time is known by God in his eternity. Therefore, from the fact that a thing exists in some period of time, it follows that it is known by God from eternity. Therefore, it cannot be granted that God can know more than he knows, because such a proposition implies that first of all he did not know, and then afterwards knew. Reply to objection 3. The ancient nominalists said that it was the same thing to say Christ is born, and will be born, and was born, because the same thing is signified by these three, viz., the nativity of Christ. Therefore it follows, they said, that whatever God knew, he knows, because now he knows that Christ is born, which means the same thing as that Christ will be born. This opinion, however, is false, both because the diversity in the parts of a sentence causes a diversity of enunciations, and because it would follow that a proposition which is true once would be always true, which is contrary to what the philosopher lays down, Categories Book 3, when he says that this sentence, Socrates sits, is true when he is sitting, and false when he rises up. Therefore it must be conceded that this proposition is not true. Whatever God knew, he knows, if referred to enunciable propositions, but because of this, it does not follow that the knowledge of God is variable, for as it is without variation in the divine knowledge that God knows one and the same thing to be, and sometime not to be, so it is without variation in the divine knowledge that God knows an enunciable proposition is sometime true and sometime false. The knowledge of God, however, would be variable if he knew enunciable things by way of enunciation, by composition and division, as occurs in our intellect. Hence, our knowledge varies either as regards truth and falsity. For example, if when either as regards truth and falsity, for example, if when a thing suffers change, we retained the same opinion about it, or as regards diverse opinions, as if we first thought that anyone was sitting, and afterwards thought he was not sitting, neither of which can be in God. Article 16. Whether God has a speculative knowledge of things. Objection 1. It seems that God has not a speculative knowledge of things, for the knowledge of God is the cause of things, as shown above, Article 8. But speculative knowledge is not the cause of things known, therefore the knowledge of God is not speculative. Objection 2. Further, speculative knowledge comes by abstraction from things, which does not belong to the divine knowledge, therefore the knowledge of God is not speculative. On the contrary, whatever is the more excellent must be attributed to God, but speculative knowledge is more excellent than practical knowledge, as the philosopher says in the beginning of Metaphysics. Therefore God has a speculative knowledge of things. I answer that some knowledge is speculative only, some is practical only, and some is partly speculative and partly practical. In proof whereof it must be observed that knowledge can be called speculative in 3 ways. First, on the part of the things known, which are not operable by the knower, such is the knowledge of man about natural or divine thing. Secondly, as regards the manner of knowing, as, for instance, if a builder consider a house by defining and dividing, and considering what belongs to it in general, for this is to consider operable things in a speculative manner, and not as practically operable, for operable means the application of form to matter, and not the resolution of the composite into its universal formal principles. Thirdly, as regards the end, for the practical intellect differs in its end from the speculative. As the philosopher says, De Anima, Book 3, for the practical intellect is ordered to the end of the operation, whereas the end of the speculative intellect is the consideration of truth. Hence, if a builder should consider how a house can be made, not ordering this to the end of the operation, but only to know how to do it, this would be only a speculative considerations as regards the end. Although it concerns an operable thing, therefore, knowledge which is speculative, by reason of the thing itself known, is merely speculative. But that which is speculative either in its mode or as to its end is partly speculative and partly practical, and when it is ordained to an operative end, it is simply practical. In accordance with this, therefore, it must be said that God has of himself a speculative knowledge only, for he himself is not operable, but of all other things he has both speculative and practical knowledge. He has speculative knowledge as regards the mode, for whatever we know speculatively in things by defining and dividing, God knows all this much more perfectly. Now of things which he can make, but does not make at any time, he has not a practical knowledge, according as knowledge is called practical from the end. But he has a practical knowledge of what he makes in some period of time. And as regards evil things, although they are not operable by him, yet they fall under his practical knowledge, like good things, inasmuch as he permits or impedes or directs them, as also sicknesses fall under the practical knowledge of the physician, inasmuch as he cures them by his art. Reply to Objection 1. The knowledge of God is the cause, not indeed of himself, but of other things. He is actually the cause of some, that is, of things that come to be in some period of time, and he is virtually the cause of others, that is, of things which he can make, and which nevertheless are never made. Reply to objection 2. The fact that knowledge is derived from things known does not essentially belong to speculative knowledge, but only accidentally insofar as it is human. In answer to what is objected, on the contrary, we must say that perfect knowledge of operable things is obtainable only if they are known insofar as they are operable. Therefore, since the knowledge of God is in every way perfect, he must know what is operable by him, formally as such, and not only insofar as they are speculative. Nevertheless, this does not impair the nobility of his speculative knowledge, forasmuch as he sees all things other than himself in himself, and he knows himself speculatively, and so in the speculative knowledge of himself, he possesses both speculative and practical knowledge of all other things.